A Ransomed Grete, an ever-after mystery. Written by Chautona Havig. Narrated by Krista Del Sorbo. Once upon a time. Centuries ago, one of Austria's most noble families built a small fortress in the forests south of Salzburg and east of Kuchel. There, hidden among the tall, stately trees and with woodland creatures as their neighbors, the family lived in peace and harmony for a century. If only such times could last forever. But, as in many families, jealousies blossomed in the hearts of sisters and pricked them with harsh thorns. Contentions sprang up between brothers and choked out the love that should reign supreme until one day, as with the first brothers, a son lay dead, a mother grieved, and a family warred within itself until the comforting castle became a battleground that lay in waste. Many years passed before one of the grandsons of the slain baron tore down what was left of the fortress, burying the family's past until almost no one remembered it. Only one old woman who lived near the village still knew the story, one passed on by her grandmother who had been a servant in the house. Fearful that someone might learn of the ugly history, in the spring of 1697, the new Baron von Gangl invited her to tea. The unsuspecting woman came, delighted to be so honored, and never went home again. Confident the past could now be permanently laid to rest, the Baron rebuilt the family fortress into a lovely chateau, a place to bring his bride. This is how Schloss Versteck became Chateau Versteck, and how what would become the Gangl family managed to truly bury the skeletons in their castle. If only that grandson had recalled the old adage, history repeats itself. Chapter 1. May 1st, 1938, Kuchel, Austria. Albert Gangl had been staring at the same newspaper headline every morning for over 6 weeks. Chancellor Schuschnigg under house arrest. It could have been his name on the headline, if anyone cared enough to put it there, that is. They'd escaped Vienna just in time. Without a doubt, had they stayed, Albert and his wife Mina would also be under house arrest, or worse. Not for the first time, he felt the urge to reach into the drawer of his walnut desk and pull out the bottle of ink kept there. One splash across the page and... He sighed. And what? Nothing. Nothing would change at all. Burning it wouldn't change anything either. As if to remind himself of that, he straightened the pen holder above his desk pad and removed the reading glasses he didn't need for such a large headline. "I don't know why you keep reading that awful newspaper." Albert looked up to find his wife standing in the open doorway, pouting again. No doubt she felt as if she were under house arrest. "Are you feeling better this morning, Mina?" The tight smile she gave him told Albert that no, the illness that had plagued his wife since returning to their chateau in the forests southeast of Salzburg had not abated. He had his suspicions, of course, but until his wife chose to share the news they'd waited nearly 10 years to celebrate, he would be patient. Though a lovely spring day outside, already climbing into the 60s, Albert had a fire crackling in the grate. His family home could be chilly, even in summer, and especially with doors open to allow in fresh air. He rose and moved from behind the old walnut desk that had once been his father's. Albert beckoned Mina to join him on the large velvet sofa, and when she reached his side, he pulled her close, kissing her cheek. "You radiate health and beauty, my dear." "If only my stomach agreed with you." The slow smile that formed, the way she refused to look at him, the sliding of her hand over her belly. "I think it may last for some time, Albert." "Should we send for a doctor?" The way Mina pressed her lips into a tight line told him she wouldn't be able to keep her secret for long. "In due time." Was it his imagination, or did she put the slightest emphasis on due? The breeze blew in, sending a shiver through her. "Shall I close the doors to the terrace?" "No, my love. The fresh air helps." While he deliberated between pressing her for more information or guessing, Mina snuggled closer and sighed. He'd just decided to ask when the roar of a vehicle and the crunch of tires on gravel drifted through the open doors. Who could that be? That was a question he did not care to answer. Chateau Versteck was situated in a rural area with few vehicles at all. Albert could think of only one reason a vehicle had come all the way up to their home, and he didn't like it. "Perhaps you should go lie down. I'll make your—" "No. What is it?" She stared at him, eyes wide. Mina could always read him and read him well. "I think you will see soon enough, my dear." A gentle knock preceded their housekeeper's arrival. The manservant they'd had for years hadn't been there when they'd returned to the chateau from Vienna. "Excuse me, a man, Captain—" The door burst open and the woman was shoved aside as an imperious man entered the room.
"I am Captain Franz Lechner."
"Captain?" Albert tried to show civility he did not feel. "Welcome—"
"You can hardly doubt why I am here."
The man's gray uniform showed him as part of Hitler's army. How quickly his countrymen capitulated. Albert shook his head. "I do not." Steel blue eyes pierced through him, but Albert refused to flinch. "May I introduce my wife, Mina?" He'd rather not have, but it was possible the man might be more civil should he be alerted to a woman's presence. The captain's gaze roamed over the room, likely taking in the comfortable situation, the lovely view out the doors, the elegance and quality of everything that was his family home, and had been for centuries. It landed on Mina, and a smile formed. "Keep your lecherous thoughts off your face, you cad." Though he thought it, Albert knew better than to state it if he wanted to protect her from more than insolence.
"Frau Gangl?"
Mina inclined her head. She turned to Albert. "I'm sorry, but I should lie down again. Will you take care of our guest for me?" Captain Lechner scowled, but said nothing until Mina had nearly reached the door.
"You are being offered a choice, Herr Gangl, something for which you should be grateful. Oberleutnant Waldheim has instructed me to offer you, due to your excellent service in the last war, a position in the Stutzstaffel. He received permission from Himmler himself. It is a great honor which, of course, you will accept."
Though he could have happily vomited all over the carpet, Albert kept himself as collected as he could manage.
"I misunderstood you then. I thought you said I was offered a choice. What is the alternative?" "Because we both know I will not be accepting the position." "Sachsenhausen!"
Mina's cry from behind the door told them both she had not gone upstairs. With speed he hadn't seen her exhibit in years, she flew across the study and into his arms. "Accept, Albert, you must." He held her, trying to infuse strength into her, as he asked, "What will happen to my wife if I should choose the latter?" "Albert, no!"
"If you are so foolish," Captain Lechner sneered, "I cannot say. Oberleutnant Waldheim trusted that a loyal citizen and hero from the last war would know his duty. Was he wrong?"
Before he answered, he had to get Mina out of the room. "You're trembling, darling." She was, but not so the captain could see. "Go lie down. We'll discuss the situation in a few minutes. I should offer our guest refreshments, and you look ready to collapse." "Frau Bauer, Frau—" The woman appeared too quickly not to have been waiting close by. Waiting and listening. "Please, take my wife to her room and get her comfortable. We would also appreciate—" He looked at the man before him. "Pastries or belegte Brot?"
"Neither." The captain remembered his manners. "I appreciate the offer."
"Schnapps?" he asked.
"Yes, danke."
Albert poured some of the fruit brandy into a small tumbler and offered it to Lechner. The captain eyed him over the top of the glass.
"And for you?"
"I am not thirsty."
"You did not answer my question."
Gesturing to one of the chairs near the open doors, Albert moved to take the other. "Please, be seated." Which question was that? I'm afraid my wife distracted me. She has not been well.
I asked Herr Gangl if the Oberleutnant was wrong about you. He believes you know your duty.
And he is correct. Albert's gut wrenched at the sight of the man's scowl. He was right. Lechner had wanted him to refuse, and it galled to give the man the satisfaction. Knocking back the drink in one gulp, Captain Lechner nodded and rose.
You are expected to report in 3 days' time.
And where do I report? Albert took a deep breath, steadied himself, and added, Do I go directly to Sachsenhausen or... Disgust churned in his gut as the man's eyes glittered.
You refuse the gracious offer of a prestigious position in...
He'd be marched out of there in minutes, likely without being given the opportunity to say goodbye to Mina, but he had no choice. To work for the SS? Never. I do. Perhaps if he simply excused himself to say goodbye, Captain Lechner would be so happy to see him sent off that he'd allow it. I'll just say goodbye to Mina. Am I to bring anything? When the captain didn't respond, he decided he'd grab a small suitcase with a few changes of clothes and necessary toiletries. They might well take them away, but then again... Shaking, Mina allowed herself to be led up the wide, curving staircase and down the hallway to her room. She stepped out of her shoes and lowered herself onto the chaise longue. Would you please bring me coffee, Frau Bauer? I feel a headache coming on. Perhaps one of your tarts? You know they always make me feel better. The lies piled on top of each other until she began to feel sick. Just as the housekeeper agreed and turned to go, Mina grabbed a fistful of the woman's skirt. You don't think, she whispered, that he'll be taken away, do you? The motherly woman turned and took her hand. Don't you worry. The Freiherr always does what is right. He's a good man. That's what I'm afraid of. Tears slid down her face in a steady torrent as the housekeeper slipped through the door and down the hallway. This time, Mina left off her shoes. She waited until she felt certain Frau Bauer had made it down the stairs and back toward the kitchens before she ran along the hallway and down to the ground floor. Just outside the study door, she heard the conversation, and her heart constricted tighter at each word her husband spoke. Then he said he'd come see her. She could convince him, tell him about the baby. That would make him see why he couldn't leave her alone. Principles are all well and good, but responsibility to one's family is as or more important as responsibility to one's principles. She'd just turned to go when the unmistakable sound of a gunshot rang out in the study. Mina froze. So loud. So loud. Her heart told her that Arthur would never shoot anyone, but her head insisted he must have. The alternative was too... A groan preceded a thud by only a second or two. Without waiting another moment, she dashed through the door and came nearly nose to nose with a revolver. Behind that revolver stood Captain Lechner.
Your husband, Frau Gangl, was a coward. He tried to flee.
Inside, she railed against him, but that gun in her face froze her vocal cords. He did not try to flee. You killed him. Black spots danced before her eyes. Albert, I must help him. Chapter 2. October 12th, 1939, Vienna, Austria. Whispers filled the marketplace, but Anna Eisler pulled her daughter through to the butcher's and refused to listen. Had refused to listen for the last 18 months. It couldn't be getting worse. It just couldn't be. What could be worse than her husband's death on Kristallnacht, their forced move from the country to Vienna, or the lack of children playing in the streets? Some of the mothers had placed their sons and daughters on the Kindertransport and prayed that they'd be reunited soon, but not Anna. Her Greta had already lost a father. To lose a mother, too. To be sent to strangers in a strange country where she didn't understand the language. To be with all those grieving orphans. No, Greta was not an orphan, and never would be if she had anything to do about it. God may have forsaken his people, but Anna Eisler would not forsake her daughter.
Come, Knuddlemouse, we must hurry. But you don't wish to play with Heidi?
Bribing her daughter. What would Joseph have said if he heard her? Anna knew all too well, but it worked. Greta skipped alongside her and waited as patiently as could be expected in the long line at the butcher's shop. Anna could only afford one sausage, but it would give their soup flavor. Greta licked her lips as the butcher wrapped their sausage. Once outside, Greta pleaded to carry it all by herself.
It looks delicious, Mooty.
Maybe it will help my little cuddle mouse grow into a great big mouse.
I can show Heidi. Can she have some soup?
And on the little girl chattered all the way up the street to the 2 little rooms they rented. Once the sausage had been carried all the way up to those frigid attic rooms, Greta raced outside to find her little friend.
She's too young to go outside alone,
Anna's mother would have said. Anna couldn't help but throw back a mental rebuttal. And you never had to try to shush my crying at night when the bad dreams came to remind me that my Fati was gone forever. The patter of her daughter's feet came rushing back.
Mooty!
The name reached her just as Greta flung open the door.
Frau Strobel says you must come. She has news for you.
More footsteps followed, and Heidi, nearly a head taller than her Greta and only a year older, burst into the room.
It's true. Mooty wants you, but she has to watch the stove.
And I have to cook my child's food. Despite Anna's complaints, she knew Olga Strobel wouldn't ask for her if it weren't important. I'll come down after I wash up. Why don't you girls go tell Olga for me? Rain began to patter against the window as Anna started for the door. She buttoned her sweater while hurrying down the stairs and set her hat on her head. The old thing looked ratty, but she had to stretch their savings as far as possible until Greta was old enough for school. Then she could work while her daughter was safe in a classroom. Just another year or 2. She could make it. She knew it. Olga opened the door, wiping her hands on an apron, and beckoned Anna to follow. She handed tiny cakes to Heidi and 2 teacups to Greta.
You girls go have a tea party in Adelaide's room.
Anna's heart sank. If Olga and Georg decided that Heidi couldn't play with her daughter anymore, Greta's heart would break. Olga beckoned her closer.
Shh, the girls mustn't hear. Georg came home for just a minute. The rumors are true. They put hundreds of Jews, maybe thousands, on the trains.
Olga glanced behind her to be certain the girls weren't listening before adding,
Nisko, Anna. They're shipping everyone to Poland. Kristallnacht is nothing to what this is going to be. Georg says you must send Greta on the Kindertransport immediately. You must.
No! At Olga's scowl, Anna lowered her tone. I cannot risk losing her forever.
They'll pack you all in like cattle in those train cars. Greta would never survive the trip. Not as cold as it's getting already.
With so many of us, Anna protested, we'll be warm. Her eyes widened and her heart pounded. Had she just defended the idea of taking her daughter in a cattle car? What would Joseph have said to that? But instead of scolding, Olga stirred her pot again and wiped her hands on her apron. She came and cupped Anna's cheeks in her hands. Joseph says the anti-Jewish sentiment grows stronger every day. Even if you stayed, you would not be safe. You won't be able to stay in your flat. Her flat. 2 small rooms at the top of a cold house that would be even colder in winter. But Anna didn't argue that point. We have nowhere to go. And before you insist on the Kindertransport, they want orphans and homeless children. Greta is neither. Those children have a greater need. A warm glow of satisfaction filled her at those words. Her daughter wasn't an orphan. Her daughter still had a living parent. But Olga acted as if she hadn't spoken.
Georg says he can take her to Kugel. There's a woman there who lives in the forest in a beautiful chateau. She takes in Jewish children and puts them on the Kindertransport. He'll bring her up there and give our address for where her family in England or Holland can write to tell where she is.
Olga hugged her close and whispered,
You won't lose her. We'll help. But...
And here it came. Olga would say they couldn't associate with her anymore. Anna had tried to stay on the outskirts of the Jewish communities, to disassociate herself from them. She had reasonably fair hair and hazel eyes. It wasn't the blonde hair and blue eyes the Nazis wanted, but she was more Aryan in appearance than Herr Hitler was for certain. She'd hoped.
Anna, you cannot be so selfish. They will put you on the trains. They will take you to Poland. And if Grete is still here, she will not survive. You would kill your child to keep her close.
Fury welled up in her and spilled over in tears, sobs. That was the worst of it. Not only would she do it, but she'd also already decided to. But Olga spoke the truth. Grete had always been frail and small. She didn't look her 5 years. She was ill most of the winter, and always at the change of seasons or temperatures. I can't lose her, too, she sobbed.
Then let us take her and send her to safety in England, where there is plenty of food and healthy countryside to play in. You can go get her once this madness ends.
Olga closed her eyes.
Please, God, let it end.
Anna hardened her heart to the prayer. God had forsaken his people, had forsaken her, Grete. But the Strobels had not. And if Georg said he would take Grete himself, he would.
Anna.
All right. She wilted and fumbled for the stool. Sitting down, she dropped her head in her hands and wept. All right. November 13th, 1939. Kuchel, Austria. Hans Hartmann looked around him and then moved to where a young woman sat by a window, her gaze fixed on something inside. As he neared, he watched her insert a telegram into an envelope and pass it off to a boy who waited for it. Well, there wouldn't be a telegram for him. But as he passed the window, a rapping stopped him. The woman beckoned him to come closer. She pointed to a bench down by the train platform.
The little girl. Take her with you.
With me? Why? And how do you know where I'm going? I don't even know where I'm going. All the anger he'd fought to brush off returned with that thought. His mother had put him on the train using precious shillings. No, Reichsmarks. To do so, and against his father's wishes. Against my wishes, too. Hans nursed his indignation at being treated like a small child until he reached the corner of the building, but the young woman appeared and interrupted him.
You're going to Chateau Versteck, yes?
Did he admit it? Mutti hadn't told him. If he did, would she turn him over to some German soldier bent on packing him onto the trains heading east? Mutti wanted him to go west where it was safe. Holland, Sweden, or even England. Sent away like a little boy still sucking his thumb. The indignation reared itself again.
You are good. That little girl?
She pointed to a small child wearing a scarlet coat.
She's supposed to go too. I planned to take her after work, but she's probably hungry and tired. She can go with you.
I don't know where the chateau is. Yes, he sounded aggrieved, even to his own ears. Well, he was aggrieved. Of all the...
Just follow that road until another wide road branches off, big enough for a large automobile. Then follow that until you see the chateau. It's hidden, but you will see it if you stay on the road. Green roof, gold walls, Baroque.
He didn't know what Baroque looked like, but after he found the place, Hans supposed he would.
What's the kid doing there? She was left to go to the chateau this morning, For the same reason you're going, I expect. But you should hurry.
The young woman tucked a tendril of hair that had dared to escape the braid behind her ear and leaned forward to whisper,
It's not safe here anymore. Get to the chateau and take that child with you.
With each word she'd grown more severe until Hans wanted to stalk off and tell her to mind her own business. But he couldn't. Not after Mutti had defied Papa to protect him. Still, he couldn't bring himself to thank her for the warning. Instead, he took off to the bench where the little girl sat watching them.
Come on, let's go.
Without a word, the little girl slid off the bench, grabbed a small satchel, and followed him up the road. People watched, many turning away as if not wanting to see. A boy scowled at him. Hans scowled right back. They'd made it to the corner when an old man stopped them.
Don't go to the chateau.
Before Hans could ask why, the roundest woman he'd ever seen fairly rolled out to the street and dragged the man away, scolding all the while.
Don't talk to the kinder. You'll be punished. We'll all be punished.
There wasn't anywhere else they could go. He only had the money his Mutti had sent for his care, and he doubted the little girl had even that. He'd promised to give that money to the woman at the chateau. He must keep his word. It was getting cold already. For just a moment he considered opening his suitcase and pulling out his jacket, but after walking a while, he'd probably find it too warm. Better to just move along. They'd made it just past the last building in the village before the little girl spoke.
Why shouldn't we go?
I don't know. Probably because we're Jews. He looked at her.
Are you Juden? You don't look like it.
The child shrugged.
I'm to go on the Kindertransport to England, to be safe and healthy until Mutti comes for me.
Then she must be. What's your name?
Grete.
How old are you? When Grete said 5, he snorted. I don't believe you.
I am. It was my birthday in March, and I turned 5.
She was awfully small for 5. He didn't know much about younger children, but as small for his age as he was, Hans could tell she looked far younger than 5. No, 5.5 years old.
How old are you?
Having scoffed at her age, Hans was loath to admit his own, but he stood as tall and straight as he could while lugging a suitcase uphill.
11.
But Grete seemed to take it in stride.
That's more than 2 of me, because 5 fingers and 5 fingers.
She tried to hold out both hands in front of her, but couldn't while carrying the satchel.
Makes 10 fingers.
Are you going to chatter all the way? A sniffle suggested that no, she did not plan to chatter. She'd cry.
I want Mutti.
Well, I'd like to see my Mutti too, but we have to get to the chateau. It's what our Muttis want for us. It seemed to stifle Grete's words, but she still sniffled. A small part of Hans wished he could get away with a good cry himself. This wasn't what his mother had expected. She'd said there would be someone to take him and other children to the chateau, to protect them until another train headed west and far away from Austria where it was no longer safe to be Jewish. My father's not Jewish, he growled out as if it would mean anything to anyone.
My Fati is dead.
Another sniffle. A pang of remorse struck him hard. At least his father wasn't gone forever, just until it was safe for him to return home. Hans had seen his Mutti leave a note for Papa telling him she'd gone on the trains to Poland so that he would be safe from the work camps, those places for criminals. Why? Because Papa had married a woman whose family had been Jewish. That was his crime. So his brave Mutti had saved him from whatever would wait for her in Poland and his father from the camps. And maybe, because of a rumor, it might not even be true. Mutti's friends had argued with her, pleaded with her. He wanted to believe them, but he didn't. Mutti was clever. Papa had always said she was the cleverest person he knew. She wouldn't do this to them if she weren't sure. But a tiny niggle of doubt added,
But is being certain enough? You can be certain and still be wrong, can't you?
When they turned into the road that the young woman had insisted would take them to the chateau, the forest loomed ahead. Greta moved closer, and Hans sighed. She shifted her bag again, something she did every 100 yards or so. This time, however, she moved to his other side as she changed hands and slipped her little hand into his free one.
I'm scared.
Though he never would have admitted it, especially not to a whiny little girl. But Hans was scared too, and it wasn't fair to call her whiny. She hadn't complained that much.
We'll be there soon. Can we walk in the dark?
In the dark. They'd be there long before dark, surely.
We won't need to.
Then, unable to help himself, he added,
But we should hurry. If night falls before we arrive, bears might decide we'd make a tasty supper.
The girl just sniffled and kept trudging forward. To his relief, she let go of his hand to shift the satchel into her other hand. Hans wanted to shift too, but then she could grab his hand again. He kept plodding up the road, determined not to do it. The kid shifted twice in that time, placing her hand in his and taking it out again whenever she must. 100 feet later, he shifted. 15 feet after that, Greta moved around behind him again and slipped her hand back into his once more.
You're brave.
Hans's pride swelled. Well, it wasn't her fault she was here after all. And feeling rather grown up, he took her bag from her and tucked it under his arm like he'd seen his father do when carrying several suitcases. He made it a whole 20 or 30 feet before it finally slipped out onto the road. Greta cried out and dropped his hand to grab it. The expected complaint never came. Instead, she apologized, hefted it again, and took his hand with her jaw set and determined.
She's not so bad, I suppose.
A quarter mile or so up the road, Greta stumbled. Another 100 feet, and she fell. When the girl tried to get up, she couldn't. Tears fell again, and this time she couldn't seem to stop. Between gasps and sobs, she apologized. Then she curled in a ball right there in the middle of the road and went on crying. Hans didn't know what to do. He couldn't just leave her there. But it could be miles still. He just didn't know. When he remembered how his father had carried him when he was little, Hans knelt beside her.
Come on, try to climb up on my back. I'll try to carry you on my shoulders. It'll be fun, you'll see.
Greta didn't look like she thought it would be fun, and he certainly didn't think it would be fun. But she managed to hook her little stick legs, she must have bones like a bird's, around his neck. Stumbling to his feet, he managed to get a bag in each hand and took off down the road.
Don't put your hands over my eyes and don't pull my hair, but you have to keep your balance. I can't carry these and you and still hold on to you.
After a few close calls where he'd almost lost her and dropped the bags twice, Greta managed to grab the front of his shirt in each fist and only slightly choke him as they trudged up the road. And that road seemed to go on forever. They stopped often to give his arms and back a break and for Greta to find a place to relieve herself. Dampness on his neck hinted that she'd made a mess of it, and Hans nearly threw up. Sunset approached, turning the sky a vivid golden and pink, when Hans first saw the signs of a roof in the distance. Around a bend, and it disappeared. Around another bend, and there it was. It had to be Chateau Versteck. At the cobbled drive, Hans set Greta down and handed her the satchel. I think we're here.
It's still so far.
This time the words came out in a definite whine. Hans took one step forward, then another.
It'll get shorter with every step. Let's go.
By the third step, she'd caught up to him. The drive had to be 100 yards or more. By 10, Greta had taken his hand again. By 20, she flagged, but the girl kept going anyway. Maybe she wasn't so bad. Maybe. Darkness crept across the landscape just as they neared the front door. The last rays of sunlight had turned the tree leaves a glowing golden red, but now they looked dull and grew duller as the light faded. When he reached for the knocker, Grete looked up at him, eyes wide, and whispered,
"Now, I'm really scared."
He'd never have admitted it to her, but Hans thought it.
Me too.
Chapter 3. The fire needed tending, but Mina couldn't bring herself to ring for someone to add a log, much less do it herself. Instead, she wrapped the cardigan she wore tighter around her and closed her eyes as if it would bar out the cold. The temperature had dropped quickly in the last few minutes, and the room felt the chill. An early storm, perhaps? Frau Bauer tapped on the door.
"Ma'am, there are children here, from the station."
Children? She'd received no message about more children. She'd hoped never to have any more again now that the deportations to Poland had begun in earnest.
"Who retrieved them?"
They walked. Frau Bauer moved to the fire and began poking at it.
"Should I show them to rooms, or—"
I suppose. What else could she do? If children were here, they were here. The question of who sent them remained, but she could investigate that later. Perhaps she wouldn't have to call about sugar.
"The little girl looks peaked. I think she needs a hot meal and a hot bath. The boy is tired, but he glows with health, as boys do after a hard game or tramp. I think he carried her part of the way."
A weak child, and with the weather turning colder every night. Perhaps she should move them down a floor, with no other children there. But no, Mina swallowed hard. If someone came to inspect, she would have explanations. Better to keep things the same. Perhaps they might like a few more blankets.
"I'll see to it."
The housekeeper moved to go, but stopped at the door.
"Would you like to see them before I take them upstairs?"
Mina shuddered, but kept her voice steady.
"That won't be necessary."
When the door closed behind Frau Bauer, Mina rose to stand closer to the fire. Her trembling grew stronger until she had to shake herself to overcome it. It seemed an odd irony to her, but she preferred irony to the tragedy and travesty that had become her life. The old temptation to sit down and have a good pout danced pirouettes around her, taunting, teasing, and finally pleading with her. But the luxury of those days had drowned in the pool of her husband's blood on his study floor. It had died with the child she never got to hold. The rest of her pampered life had been buried when Lechner returned a few months after he'd killed her husband and told her what she must do. Straightening her spine and squaring her shoulders, Mina moved to the bookshelf, pulled down the copy of Mein Kampf, and carried it upstairs to her room. There she pulled on a thick cardigan and went to find out why children had appeared without warning. Then she'd make the call. Chateau Versteck, having originally been rebuilt in the 17th century in the popular Baroque style, and despite its thick walls, was cold without fires in each room to keep it warm. But the attic rooms at the top of the domed towers didn't have fireplaces or even windows. They relied on heat rising from the floors below. The colder it got, the more the children would suffer. Well, she couldn't think about that. They wouldn't be there long, after all. With these two here, there would probably be a few more coming, and then they'd be sent away again. Perhaps then it would be the end of the influx of children in and out of her home. She'd have prayed for that, if only she believed a God still existed, if he ever had. Albert would have chided her for her lack of faith, but who could blame her for doubting? Where was the evidence of God in this wretched world? If he did exist, if he had allowed Albert to be murdered for having principles, then he wasn't worth her devotion, much less her husband's. At the top of the stairs, she found Hetty preparing a bath.
"The little girl needs washing, and the boy, Hans, says he does too."
The girl dropped her gaze at Mina's sharp look.
"He carried her much of the way. He seems a good boy. The girl is sweet, but misses her Mutti."
The girl's name?
"Grete."
With a slight bob of respect, the maid scuttled off, likely back to the bathroom on the floor below to refill the bucket with steaming water. The doors to both rooms stood closed. Though she should have spoken first to the boy who was obviously older, Mina found herself drawn to the idea of a sweet girl missing her mother. She tapped on the door to the girls' dormitory, as they called it, and opened it. "Greta?" A little girl sat on the end of one of the cots, hands folded in her lap, tears sliding down her cheeks. The poor thing. How did these parents send their children off like this? It must break their hearts. She gave herself a little shake. No, she couldn't feel compassion. Parents like that deserved to lose their children forever. Der Führer was right. Those Jews weren't human. They couldn't be to send away a little girl like this. Greta met her gaze with shimmering eyes. Hazel eyes, weren't they? Mina stepped closer, her heart constricting. In the dim light provided by the small oil lamp they'd put in the room, she confirmed the child had hazel eyes with as much blue as green, just like Albert. Greta's hair was that same honey blonde as Albert's had been. Not brown, not truly golden.
Please, may I go home? I'll be good. I'll be quiet. I'll hide from the soldiers and won't let them get me.
Tears slid down the girl's cheeks.
I just want to go home.
The impulse to wrap Greta in a hug, lift her, and carry her down to the room next to hers nearly overpowered Mina. The child was small, frail. In 10 years, people would assume she'd given birth to a healthy baby all those years ago, if she kept Greta with her, that is. She looked enough like Albert that no one would ever question. No. It took more strength than she thought she had to steel her heart against the child's pleas, but she did.
You'll stay here until time for the trains. Then you'll go. In the meantime, you will do as you are told. Do you understand?
Though Greta wilted, she nodded. Tears came faster now. When Hetty returned, Mina insisted the girl be bathed immediately.
Then, a bit of soup and bed. She's clearly tired and overwrought.
Though Hetty didn't say it, Mina read the girl's mind clearly.
She's terrified and missing her mother, who wouldn't be overwrought.
Mina opened the door again and looked back.
What's your full name, child?
Greta?
A sob escaped. Greta Eisler.
And how old are you?
What is your birth date?
The girl sniffled before answering.
5. I'll be 6 on the 7th of March.
As she pulled the door shut behind her, Mina gripped the knob and held fast. She could do this. It would be the last time, surely. With head high, she marched to the door opposite and knocked. A soft, "Yes?" came as she turned the knob. The boy standing against the wall looked small as well. What was wrong with these Jewish parents? Didn't they feed their children? She watched as he stared at the wall as if out a window. Then he sighed and turned to face her, one half of his face shadowed and making him look menacing for just a moment. They really needed to put electric lighting up here, if only for safety reasons. Oh well, keeping the matches from the children would do for now.
Thank you for helping us, the boy said. He didn't sound very sincere. My mother asked that I express her sincere gratitude.
He stuck his hand in his pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped packet tied in string.
This is for you.
Without looking at it, Mina pocketed the packet and began her questions.
How did you discover Versteck? I don't know.
The boy shrugged as he spoke.
Mutti heard somewhere and sent me while Father was at work. I think she's going on the trains to Poland, but she wanted me safe first.
What Mina wanted to do was close her eyes, inhale deep and long, and then let out the most ear-piercing scream she could manage. Instead, she sighed.
Your name? Hans Hartmann. And your age, birth date?
Why she was expected to have these details hadn't made sense, but Lechner had been adamant. Date and time of arrival, Names, birth dates, number of days there, illnesses, everything. Hans didn't look 11 any more than Grete looked 5. Had the parents told them to lie to ensure transport? And how do you know Grete Eisler? I don't. At her scowl, he added, When I arrived, she was sitting there, at the station. A lady told me how to get here and said I had to bring her with me. He sounded affronted at the expectation, but Mina didn't suppose she could blame him. What boy his age, if it was his age, wanted to be responsible for a small child? Thank you. Hetty will set up a table with food for you and Grete when she's done drawing your bath. Eat, and then sleep. She'd nearly closed the door behind her when Hans asked, When do we leave for England? Or is it Holland? Those questions were easy enough for her to answer, but he wouldn't like it. I don't know. Guten Nacht. Once she'd seated herself at the small writing desk in her room, she untied the packet. Inside, banknotes had been folded neatly, and tucked between the layers were coins as well, 75 in all. Tears sprang to her eyes. What should she do with this? Keeping it, out of the question, but would it help or hurt the boy to send it with him? She didn't know, and that was the true problem. There wasn't much she did know. Hans sat bolt upright in bed and shivered. Blackness engulfed him. Not even the tiniest sliver of light showed anywhere. A creak beneath him sent him scrambling from the bed, but his socks did little to keep the cold from assaulting his feet. He shivered again and tried to clear his mind. Why was his room so dark and cold, and why was he wearing socks? A cry outside his room brought his thoughts rushing back to him. He knew what had awakened him, and why. Grete, Chateau Versteck, Kindertransport. The cries grew louder, pitiful. Hans fumbled for the jacket he'd laid across the foot of his cot and found nothing, but his hand grasped the familiar wool when he patted the floor. At least he'd remembered to pat it. He'd already had to pull out one splinter. The little rooms they'd been given hadn't been sanded in decades. The tiniest bit of moonlight shone in through a narrow window near the roof by the stairs. It wasn't enough to see well, but compared to the utter blackness of his room, he began to make out shapes and angles. He found Grete's door and fumbled with the knob. Once inside, he couldn't see again. It was just too dark. Grete, he hissed. Crying became sobbing, working up to a feverish pitch. He had to do something, or she'd wake someone, and who knew what that meant. His toe jabbed against something, the end of the cot. Hans had never dared to think foul words, certain his father or mother would know and scold him. But here, alone in this horrible place, one he'd heard presented itself, and he spat it out. It felt good, too. He said it again, and this time Grete inserted a giggle between her sobs.
That's a bad word.
The satisfaction of saying something naughty flickered and died. A good man didn't make girls giggle at crude words. Even Hans knew that. Sorry.
I need
Hans heard the cot jiggle.
the toilet. I need it.
And if it were like last time, she'd need help cleaning up. Well, he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't.
Well, you'll have to take care of it yourself and not make a mess this time.
The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but Grete sniffled.
I can with a proper toilet or Negengebäude.
She whimpered again.
I've never had to go without something to sit on.
That was more information than he needed.
Let me find the lights or a match or something. Stay right here.
It took him another 5 minutes of fumbling around on the 3rd floor of the chateau, but he found a chain near the end of the hall and pulled it. Opening one door after another, he finally found a toilet and rushed back to her. Hans took her hand and told her to follow. Be quiet, and don't pull the chain.
But
do you want to wake them and make them angry?
maybe Not give us Frühstück, or make us walk back to the station, or... The idea of missing breakfast seemed to settle it for Grete. She agreed not to flush the toilet and followed him down the stairs into the dimly lit hall.
"Just in there," Hans whispered.
"Hurry."
While he waited, Hans looked up and down the hallway, taking in more of the decor. Rich wood doors, wainscoting, hand-painted walls at each end, and papers running the length of the hall above the wainscoting. There were sconces, beautiful ones that might have been real gold for all he knew. The carpeting that ran along the floor was thicker than any he'd ever walked on, and the wood floors beneath gleamed, even in the dim light. Grete appeared.
"Do I wash my hands?"
That prompted a smile. At least the girl had some intelligence.
"Good question. I don't think so. What if the pipes creak?"
And for all he knew, they ran from a cistern that made loud noises as well.
"Wash them well in the morning."
It's what his mother would have said. Hans felt certain.
"All right."
Grete yawned.
"The room is dark. I don't like it. Can I sleep here?"
But no, that she couldn't do, and well he knew it. But Hans had an idea.
"If you will be really brave and quiet, you can sit right there on the steps. Only go upstairs if you hear someone coming." "What if it's you? I'd go upstairs in the dark for nothing."
His smile grew.
"That's true, if you could hear me. I'll make sure you can't until it's safe for me to call your name. If you hear that, you can stay. I'll be back soon."
Finding his way through the chateau in the dark wasn't easy. He stepped into wrong room after wrong room, one with lots of windows, another with what he thought might be lots of books, another that might have held a dining table, but he couldn't be certain. But Hans knew the minute he'd found the kitchen. It was warmer than the rest, and moonlight shone directly on a work table in the middle. An old-fashioned grate, hearth, and fireplace stood at one end. A chain whacked his head as he moved toward the fireplace, hoping to find matches on the mantel. He reached up and only realized the stupidity of pulling on that chain after he'd jerked it and light spilled down on him. He had to work fast. On a shelf in the pantry, he found an old jar tucked in the back. He grabbed that. A tin of lamp oil sat on another shelf, and he poured some into the jar. Of course, some splashed out, and he had to clean that up. The rags smelled, so he took it with him. Finding matches, not as easy. Then he saw them, on a shelf to the right of the cooker. It was a big cooker, one his Mutti would have loved to have. Now, however, wasn't the time to think about her. He pulled the lid from the box and took out 5 matches. From what he could see, it didn't look as if any had been taken, so he took 5 more.
"After all, I gave her Moody's packet. There was a lot of money in that. It's not stealing if Moody paid for it."
And with that justification ringing in his mind, Hans reversed his steps through the house and up the stairs to the 3rd floor. Halfway down the hall, he began whispering,
"Grete, I'm coming. Grete, I'm coming. Grete."
Hans found her asleep on the last step, her head propped against the wall, her thumb stuck in her mouth. Just what he needed. Still, if he woke her, she might start screaming. He'd light the light first, then he'd come down and wake her. Maybe even put his hand over her mouth. At least with light she wouldn't be as scared.
"I'll even sit with her with the lamp on until she falls asleep,"
he promised himself in an attempt to assuage his guilt. Still, he would not carry her again. Chapter 4. After breakfast on the small landing at the bottom of the stairs, Hetty told Hans and Grete that they were to play outside for a while. Hans started to say what he thought of being told to play with a little girl, and thought better of it. Hetty might be a servant, but she wasn't a Jew, and these days that put her above him, regardless of her position in the household. At least outside, he might be able to explore a bit. Grete had been listless all morning, dragging her feet when called to wash up for breakfast. They'd been taken to the washroom on the floor below them first thing, which worked out well. Hetty hadn't noticed the unflushed toilet. As they made their way down the servants' staircase, it seemed that Grete didn't fare well after a disrupted night. She didn't whimper, but she struggled to keep up with him, even when he slowed down for her.
"Hurry," he urged. "You'll like the fresh air."
Grete said nothing and clomped down each step one at a time. The sound drove him mad for reasons he couldn't understand. At the ground floor, he pushed through to the kitchen and nodded at Frau Bauer.
"Guten Morgen."
Coming up behind them, Hetty rattled off how little Grete ate, how much he'd eaten, and noted that they'd both made their beds unprompted. What else would they do? Well, maybe little children like Grete didn't straighten their own bedclothes, but Hans had for as long as he could remember. His throat constricted at the memory of his father swooping him up and holding him over the bed so he could tug the top of the blanket all the way up. His little arms hadn't reached all the way across the bed, and it had been pushed nearly to the wall. What had Fati done when he'd arrived home to a cold, empty house? Had Mutti left dinner in the cold box? Had there been time?
"You two get outside and get some sun and some air. We can't have you sick."
Then, as if they had disappeared with those words, Frau Bauer turned to Hetty with an exaggerated eye roll.
"The last thing we need is another sick boy here for weeks."
Though he and Grete crept toward the kitchen door, Hans strained to hear more. So there really had been other children here, and one had stayed for some time. He wished the boy were still here. Well, he wished it until he realized that would mean the boy was still sick. Hans wouldn't wish that on anyone. He'd been sick the whole winter when he was 6, and that had been awful.
"Do you think I should get that side ready for more? Remember when we got 24 at once?"
Hetty shuddered.
"What if we're about to be inundated again?"
"Nah," the housekeeper said as she whacked off the tops of turnips and began swirling them into a pot.
"Now that the trains are taking parents too, I doubt we'll get many more."
Hans slipped through the door, but he hadn't let it shut all the way. Had they turned the Kindertransport into a Judentransport? Were parents and children alike being deported to countries like England and Sweden?
"The Freifrau seemed surprised to see them. She didn't even call to report their arrival, did she?"
The housekeeper's voice grew closer as she answered.
"She did, this morning. I heard the call myself." "Out of sugar again, is she?"
The two women laughed as the door closed tight and blocked out any further eavesdropping. What was that about sugar? Grete's soft voice broke into his thoughts.
"I don't feel good, Hans."
He shot a dark look at the girl. She shouldn't be his problem, but she would be. The women would make sure of it so they didn't have to run up and down those stairs, and he'd be tired if he wanted to explore while the house slept. He'd have to run back and forth to ensure she didn't cry out and wake someone. If they saw him sneaking around, he'd be in trouble for sure, maybe even sent back to Vienna. Now there was an idea. If he misbehaved, would they beat him or send him home in disgrace? He could stand a beating if it meant going home to Fati.
"Can I go up to bed? I'm so tired."
Though a very small part of him had wondered if she might be exaggerating for sympathy, Hans had never met a child who wanted to be in bed in the middle of the morning, especially one who hated a dark room with no windows. He didn't have to touch her to know that she raged with fever. Just moving closer allowed him to feel the heat radiating off her. "You have a fever. Stay here." After banging on the door and calling out for help, Hetty finally opened it.
"What do you want? Can't you just play? We have work to do around here, unless you'd like to dust the ground floor and clean the windows." "It's Grete. She's feverish. I think she should lie down. Maybe have some peppermint tea. That's what my Mutti gives me when I have a fever."
The maid looked over his shoulder and after a minute swung open the door.
"Fine. Take her up and put her in bed. Then come get the tea yourself. I can't be running up and down the stairs all day and get my work done. It'll be your job to take care of her."
He'd just been about to agree, thinking he might get to explore a bit during the day that way, when a new thought occurred to him.
"Do you have a flashlight?"
Hetty might have protested, but Hans rushed on.
"It's dark in there, and there aren't any matches. I thought the lady might not want us to have them."
In a moment of genius, if he did say so himself, he added,
"Not that I can't be trusted, but how's she supposed to know that?"
Frau Bauer grunted.
"He speaks sense. If she needs a waste bucket, he'll need to see to get it down the stairs without spilling everywhere."
Was it his imagination, or did Hetty wrinkle her nose and scowl?
"I'll go see what I can find. I know there used to be one or two before Werner left. Haven't seen them since, though."
Perhaps he took them with him.
"You go on down to the garage. Look on the shelf on the back wall. I'd throw a shilling or a Reichsmark or whatever it is now that you'll find one there. Though I know there were some in the house. Maybe the butler's pantry."
When Hetty dashed for the suggested pantry, Hans could have done a polka right there. Hetty, it seemed, either didn't like the garage or didn't like extra work. Either way, he'd likely find that other one out there, and no one would guess how much he used it if they didn't know he'd retrieved it. She returned a moment later, brandishing a box torch.
"Found one. The batteries seem good, but I don't know for how long."
After handing it over, she added,
"You'll find a bucket in the cupboard over there. Use the metal one. You can never get the stench out of wood."
Or sympathy out of a puppet. How many times had Moody said that when children were cruel to one another?
"Children are often their parents' puppets. See what a child does or hear what he says, and you will know his parents."
While he knew it was only a generality, a truism, his Vati called it, Hans had been ever careful not to allow his words or actions bring shame on his parents. And now,
"I'm a prisoner in a chateau in a forest. No one but the train lady knows I'm here. They could kill me and feed me to the pigs, and no one would ever know."
He shivered at the thought, but Hetty's shrill scolding interrupted his musings.
"Well, get on with you."
He set the flashlight in the bucket and went out to find Greta and lead her upstairs again. She'd fallen asleep on the step again, poor thing. It soothed his conscience to realize he'd shown sympathy. That meant something, didn't it?
"Come on, Greta. I can't carry you up all those steps. You have to come."
The little girl's eyes opened wide, and he caught the over-brightness in them. Moody said that was a sign of sickness. How she'd known his little cough was more than that. The girl yawned, coughed, and gagged. Before she could vomit all over the torch, Hans stuffed it in his shirt.
"Come with me. The maid said you could have some peppermint tea. Would you like that?"
Greta turned adoring eyes up at him. Even Hans could see it.
"Thank you."
The words came out in a rasp, and she coughed again. A gurgle in her throat made him wince, but she just spat out phlegm on the ground. She rose, took his hand, and let him lead her inside. A last-second impulse had him saying,
"If you need to get sick, grab the bucket,"
just as he opened the door. Hetty shuddered and moved far away. He gave Frau Bauer a weak smile and said,
"I'll be back down for tea as soon as I get her back in bed. I sure hope it isn't contagious. Wouldn't want to bring it downstairs with me." "You just stay up there. Hetty will bring the tea to the bottom of the stairs." "I can get it from the bottom on the floor below so she doesn't go where we've been," he offered. "Greta might need the washroom."
Hetty jumped on that.
"Yes, do that. I can leave the top floor for later."
She gave him a harsh glare.
"You clean up after her, you hear? I'm not losing my place because a child got sick."
Sure. Come on, Greta. I'll take care of you." He took the child's hand and felt quite pleased at how selfish and thoughtless Hetty looked by contrast, and couldn't resist a smile as Frau Bauer began scolding her. When they reached the second landing, Greta gazed up at him.
"You're brave."
He blinked and stared back until he realized she'd guessed what he'd done.
"Shh,
We wouldn't want that getting around, would we? Come on. When Grete crawled ever slower up the last set of stairs, Hans hefted her with one arm like his Fati had done when he was little and nearly dropped her. The child's body felt like it would scorch him, but he managed to steady himself without dropping her or the bucket. Only when the shivering continued after he'd turned on the box torch did he realize it was the fever.
Let's just take off your shoes, leave the socks on, and cover up well. Muti says it's best to burn out a fever with heat, and we can't do that in this cold room unless you're well covered.
Grete coughed but agreed and scooted beneath the covers.
I like that light. Where'd you get it?
They gave it to me so I wouldn't burn the house down with a lamp. A slight giggle turned into a yawn.
They don't know you have oil and matches, do they?
How did you know that? He must have told her or shown her last night, but Hans couldn't remember, and that worried him. Worried him more than he cared to admit. A banging below hinted that maybe her tea had arrived.
I'll be right back. Don't fall asleep. You need the tea. It'll help. I'm tired.
And you're sick. He scowled at her. You have to stay awake, just for a couple more minutes. When she looked like she'd pout, he added, Promise me. I carried you up here. Now the least you can do is stay awake long enough to drink that tea. To her credit, Grete half complied. She managed to stay awake through half the tea, but she'd have dropped and spilled it all over her if he hadn't caught it as she drifted off in the middle of a sip. Time to explore. Chapter 5. For 3 days, Grete's fever raged. The first day, she slept so much that Hans managed to explore the entire floor below them. Large, well-appointed rooms could have housed dozens of children, but had been arranged almost as apartments with bedrooms, sitting areas, and a few with bathrooms. Rich, carved wood, crystal globes on wall sconces, elegant drapes, and oil paintings that looked as though they belonged in a museum. The entire chateau couldn't have been more different from his own home. The second and third days, he'd gone up to the rooms on the opposite side of the house as his and Grete's and explored. With 12 beds in each of the rooms up there and a large play area with an overhead oil lamp hanging from the ceiling in the room between the dormitories, Hans wondered why he and Grete had been tucked away in the other rooms with fewer beds and no way to light it easily. That fact gnawed at him whenever he woke in the night and gave Grete more tea that he made himself since Frau Bauer and Hetty slept through, helped her downstairs to use the toilet, and told her stories to help her sleep again. So, when the women took off for Kuchel the next day, and the Freifrau drove away to places unknown, he helped Grete downstairs and settled her on a sofa with a botanical book full of flower plates.
I'll be back soon. If you hear someone, call out for me. Where are you going?
I don't know. It was a lie, and he suspected she knew it, but at least she didn't argue. The book captivated her interest after a minute, and he slipped from the room. There weren't as many rooms on the ground floor as above them. An enormous room with a great chandelier and little furniture took up much of the back overlooking the gardens. As opulent as it was, it didn't interest him. The next room did, though. Several tall bookcases gave it the feel of a library, but a sofa by the fireplace, doors opening out onto a terrace, and a large carved desk hinted at a study. But the Freifrau doesn't have a husband. Desk drawers showed little. Ink bottles, pens, a penknife, and a letter opener. In a bottom drawer, he found a newspaper with the headline, Chancellor Schuschnigg under house arrest. It looked worn at the edges, as if it had been read often. Only when he left the room did Hans see it, a discoloration on the floor. A carpet had once lain there. Where had it gone? Had it been valuable? Sold to pay for what? The upkeep? Perhaps Muti's money hadn't been a bad idea after all. Upstairs, he found what had to be the Freifrau's suite. Her clothes hung in the largest wardrobe he'd ever seen. A framed photograph of a man sat on the bed table, and another of her and the man on her dressing table. They wore wedding clothes.
She does have a husband. Of course, she's a Freifrau, not Freien. Stupid.
Where was the man? Serving the German invaders. His Vati said the government had repressed any objection to the Anschluss until the vote had been just short of 100% in favor. Jews could not vote. Those married to Jews could not. Those who might have objected feared for their lives if they didn't confirm. Vati insisted the vote had been meaningless. Was this man loyal to Hitler and his army, or pressed into service to protect his home and family? A book caught his gaze and Hans clenched his fists. Loyal, the swine. He snatched up the book and carried it with him from the room. Surely the Freifrau didn't read it. Did women read such things? He stopped in the middle of the hallway and stared at the cover. Mein Kampf.
Your struggle? What struggle is that? How best to destroy families who just want to live in peace?
He flipped through the pages but didn't stop to read anything. In the middle, though, the pages looked different. As he turned each one, he found hand-lined paper, creamy in color, and with handwriting. Names? Dates?
What is this?
The sound of a vehicle, a loud one, broke through his thoughts. Hans froze, considering the book, and then raced back to the room and replaced it. His feet pounded on the carpeting, sending muffled thwumps echoing around him. Down the stairs, to the room where Grete sat wide-eyed and frozen. Hans pulled her and the blanket from the sofa and pushed her toward the door.
To the stairs! Hurry!
As he turned to follow, the book thumped to the floor. Despite wanting to toss out another foul word, Grete could still hear, so he bit back the word and used the seconds more profitably and replaced the book on the table beside the sofa. Grinding gears and squealing brakes sent his heart racing even faster as he dashed after Grete. She'd made it halfway up the stairs by the time he caught up with her. Without a second thought, he scooped her up in his arms and rushed up the rest of the stairs. His lungs screamed as he hurried up the final flight of the main staircase. There, he set Grete down and told her to run as lightly as she could to the end of the hall where the stairs to their dark chambers stood.
Be quiet,
he hissed. Even from so high, the banging of the door knocker sounded as if right on the other side of the wall. Was it his imagination? The thin window allowing the sound to travel? Hans didn't know, but he pushed Grete ahead of him and into her room. That's when he realized he'd left the box torch on the table by the couch.
Oh, no. What?
I have to go back down.
No!
Grete's wail sounded like a siren to him.
Shh! I don't know if people are supposed to know we're here.
The knock came again, though it sounded farther away this time. An echo in the stairwell, maybe?
I have to get the box torch. I'll be right back. Stay in bed. If someone comes in, I'll tell them you needed more tea.
He fumbled for her hand in the darkness and squeezed.
It'll be fine, little one. All will be well. You'll see.
If only he believed it. Gears ground again as he reached the second floor. Brakes squealed about the time he made it back to the sitting room Grete had used. He snatched up the box torch and walked quietly but calmly back to the stairs. He'd go back for the book and see what it was about now that the visitor had left. It would only take a minute. Bang, bang, bang! Hans froze. The visitor hadn't left. After glancing around for a place to hide, Hans did the only thing he could think of. He ran. 3 long days and nights she waited before she could bear it no longer. Anna Eisler arose early in the morning and wrapped bread, sausages, and a couple of apples in a kitchen cloth and tied it well. These she put in her purse alongside all the money she thought she could spare and her papers. If they caught her, she'd tell them she was to serve as a companion to the children leaving for England. It wouldn't be any worse than waiting around Vienna to be carted off like cattle in the cars. If nothing else, maybe I can bribe them. The train left Vienna at just past 6 o'clock. Nazi soldiers swarmed the station, and never had Anna been so grateful that she and her daughter did not look as Jewish as many of their friends. She first hid in the lavatory until she felt the train moving, and then crept out and sat behind a large family, hoping to blend. It galled to have to sneak onto the train like a criminal, but they'd never have allowed her to purchase a ticket out of Vienna. Of that, Anna had no doubt. The 3-hour ride became a game of hide and seek as Anna dodged SS officers, train officials, and businessmen. A little girl about Grete's age watched her closely, but no one else seemed to notice the woman in a chocolate-brown coat who kept disappearing into lavatories at regular intervals. By the time the train neared Salzburg, she'd finally relaxed and decided it was safe to leave the lavatory for the last time. She washed her hands and pushed open the door, only to slam it into the back of a man in uniform. Heart pounding, she began her apologies and tried to squeeze past. If she timed it right, she might reach the doors by the time the train stopped. The officer, oh yes, it was yet another SS officer, grabbed her arm.
Fällt dir was?
No, I am not all right. You're going to arrest me, and I'll never find my daughter.
She couldn't say that, of course. Then again, a closer look at the man showed a mixture of concern and amusement at her fluster. An idea flashed in her mind, and decision followed. With as frosty a tone as she could manage, her chin high and jutted out, Anna leveled a cold gaze on him and turned to go again.
Excuse me.
Though she felt him stiffen, the man released her. Anna's heart beat a march with her all the way to the doors. She grabbed the back of a seat and held fast as the train shuddered to a stop. The doors opened and she stepped out, scanning signs for a train to Kuchel. Olga had said there was one. Georg had put Grete on one all the way to Kuchel, where someone would have retrieved her and taken her to the chateau. There it was, Kuchel. She took off at a quick clip, with one eye on others purchasing tickets as she went. Several people purchased tickets without showing papers. Anna crept closer and heard the man at the counter mention Munich. Papers were requested. Sighing, she turned to go. It wasn't worth the risk. Better to try to hide on the train again. Perhaps a cargo car.
Hallein,
the next person said, and the price was given. No papers requested. Anna hesitated. Not paying for fare, it went against everything she believed in. Well, everything but rescuing her child from the clutches of strangers. That she believed in more. Perhaps she could run if asked. Or pretend she'd lost them on the train. That would work. She ordered her nerves to settle, her breaths to slow, and her heart to stay where it belonged as she stepped forward, coin purse in hand.
Kuchel bitte.
The man at the window didn't even look up. He just took her Reichsmarks and passed over the ticket. With a quick thank you, Anna rushed off toward the platform that listed Hallein and Kuchel. Only once she got on the train did it occur to her that any of the Nazi officers or soldiers on the train could demand papers of her at any moment. Still, the trip should be brief, and she'd already learned how to hide in the lavatory if she needed to. She'd just have to do it. Again. The rumors. She blamed the rumors. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. Lena Weiss pedaled up the long road toward Chateau Versteck. Her thighs burned and her arms had gone completely numb from the constant jarring of the handlebars. The roar of an engine warned that someone was coming around the bend, so she moved from the smoother center of the road to the far right and watched as a delivery truck barreled around the curve and straight toward her. She smiled. Carl. Though she tried to wave, Lena's arm didn't want to cooperate. Brakes squealed and gears ground as the truck slowed. Carl stuck his head out the window.
Heading to Versteck?
Lena nodded between pants.
Telegram.
I saw a woman walking this way and drove her over. She looked fix and fertig, so I took pity.
He glanced around them before adding,
I think she is there for the kinder.
Her heart sank.
There've been rumors.
Carl gave another furtive glance around him before dropping his tone even more.
I think it's true. I spoke to a man in Salzburg. The Kindertransport? It requires papers. The woman today? She didn't know about that paperwork.
Again, as if expecting soldiers to burst from the trees around them, Carl scanned the area before whispering.
She seemed near panicked. Banged on the door there at the chateau, but no one came before I drove off. Couldn't convince her to come with me, and I didn't like to stay.
Lena's throat went dry, and her heart pounded. The telegram sat heavy in her pocket. The captain was coming. What did that mean? She stepped away from the truck and set her foot back on the pedal.
Danke, Karl.
When the truck's gears ground into place and the engine revved, she kicked off and began pedaling. As she bounced down the road, she whispered,
Gott sei mit dir.
They would all need God with them in the coming days. The first round-roofed corner of the chateau peeked through the trees not 10 minutes later. By this time, all hope of a swift ride had screeched to a near crawl as Lena's legs refused to push forward without a second or two of rest between cycles. She'd never return in time to avoid a scolding from Peter. She should have let him bring it after all. But if something strange were happening... As Lena bobbled along the cobblestoned drive, her backside joined her legs in protest. The afternoon sunlight blazed overhead, nearly blinding her, but out of the corner of one eye, she could have sworn she saw something shift in one of the second-floor windows. However, when she stopped to gaze upward, she saw nothing. Pounding on the door did nothing. She pushed her bicycle around to the back of the chateau where the kitchen door should be and knocked there. Nothing. Twice she thought she heard a twig snap. Instinct ordered her to flee, to rush back to the train station and let Peter bring the silly telegram. At this rate, the captain would arrive before the Freifrau or her staff returned. It would be their half-day off. Instead, she pulled her bicycle out of sight and waited, listening, wondering, uncertain, and yes, just a bit terrified. Chapter 6. When Mina stepped out of the car, her leg nearly brushed against the muddy running board. Despite many admonitions to herself to refrain from such a terrible habit, Mina wrinkled her nose. If only Werner hadn't abandoned them when they'd been in Vienna. Hetty didn't appreciate being given the task, and she certainly couldn't ask Frau Bauer to do it. Mina strode toward the garage doors and hesitated. Perhaps the boy could be trusted to wash it well. Bribe him with extra food, sweets? Or would ordering it as payment for his upkeep be a better decision? Then again, he had to know what his mother had put in that packet. A voice behind her sent Mina spinning and nearly toppled her. The young woman standing there apologized and offered an envelope.
I've been waiting for you. It seemed important.
It took every bit of her concentration to prevent her hand from shaking as she accepted the envelope and tore it open. Arriving 17 November, bringing 2 guests, Captain Franz Lechner. Her heart sank.
Danke,
she whispered and fished a coin from her purse. The young woman accepted it with a half-smile and started to turn, but paused.
A few days ago, a boy and a little girl came this way. Did they arrive safely? I was surprised that no one came to retrieve them.
Heart hammering, Mina willed the perspiration filling her pores to retreat. After half a second of deliberation, she chose a concerned expression and arranged her features accordingly.
Children, what day was this? Monday. The girl arrived very early, and the boy on the 2:00 train from Salzburg.
I assumed he changed trains there from Vienna. Was it her imagination, or did this Fraulein put extra emphasis on Vienna? Well, she couldn't think about that right now. She had to distance herself from the idea.
And who came to retrieve them, did you say?
No one. They walked. She forced her eyes to widen.
Oh, my. I will ask my housekeeper about it, of course. She will know if anyone arrived, and if not, we'll begin a search. Thank you for telling me.
Though Mina knew the young woman's name, she pretended not to.
Fräulein
Weiss.
Lena Weiss. I'll ask around the village as well.
Though on the tip of her tongue to insist that wasn't necessary, Mina feared it might appear suspicious. Instead, she just nodded, thanked the young woman, and offered a drink of water. Lena pointed at her canteen in the bicycle basket and insisted she was well provided for. Again, Mina's imagination ran wild. It appeared as if Lena regretted refusing and hesitated.
If I might use your washroom, though.
The hammering in her heart sounded loud enough to make anyone suspicious, but Mina simply smiled and led the way inside.
Third door down on your left, she said as they entered the foyer. And Hetty, please be late returning today.
While Lena took care of her needs, Mina hurried into her favorite sitting room and lit a match. In seconds, the telegram blazed in the grate, flickered, and slowly died. Lena still hadn't left the washroom when Mina returned to the foyer, so she dashed to the kitchen and retrieved 2 Vanillekipferl from beneath the cake dome on the counter in the pantry. She found paraffin paper and wrapped them before hurrying out. Lena stood in the foyer, glancing around as if awed by it. Well, Chateau Versteck was a fine home. Albert had been a good choice of husband, except for his unfailing principles. Look where those had gotten him. And her.
I brought you some Vanillekipferl for your ride back to town. I had some with my coffee this morning. Perfection, as always.
She passed over the packet of cookies and smiled.
Thank you again for telling me about the Kinder. I'll make inquiries to find out what happened at once.
The young woman couldn't stay longer without being rude, and if the look she gave Mina meant anything, she knew Mina had set it up that way.
Danke.
Only when she saw the bicycle round the corner of the drive and dip out of sight did Mina relax. She steadied herself with a small goblet of brandy and strode up 2 flights of stairs to the bottom of the ones leading to the attics.
Hans? Hans?
Footfalls preceded the thunder of steps on the stairs. The boy stood before her looking nervous. Or was it guilty?
How's Greta?
Better. He hesitated before adding, but not much.
Frau Bauer is bringing back a chicken. We'll make broth. That will help. Is she safe alone for a little while?
She's sleeping, he said, but the boy sounded as if he didn't want to admit it.
Good.
Mina beckoned for him to follow. Out front, she pointed to the car.
It's filthy. The rain last night made a mess of the roads. I need you to wash it for me. Then I'll put it in the garage.
Hans didn't seem fazed by her request. He walked around the vehicle almost as if he'd never seen one before, nodding at her.
Where will I find a bucket? And the water? Do I get that from the kitchen? Will Frau Bauer mind?
Before she could answer, he shook his head.
It should be moved to the cobblestones, or you'll get dirty when you walk back to move it.
He pointed to the dirt and gravel area where she'd parked it.
Excellent thought. You'll find a bucket in the garage there, and polishing cloths, too.
Mina relented after that.
There are Vanillekipferl in the kitchen when you're done. I'll leave some for both you and Greta on a plate, if you think she can eat them.
When he shot her a surprised look, Mina swallowed hard.
Well, you are doing me a kindness, and...
She fumbled for a more plausible reason. His smallness would do.
You could use some more meat on your bones.
Paul Jaeger turned off the main road onto the one indicated by Captain Lechner, his mind still on the troubled and, if he were correct, terrified young woman who had bumped into him on the train. Despite every effort to show irritation, she hadn't been able to hide her fear. It wasn't the first time that someone had recoiled from him. their fear almost palpable, but it was the first time he'd noticed desperation behind it. A frequent intruder into his mind, the thought resurfaced.
Is fear the best avenue for inspiring loyalty?
Beside him, Herr Werner fidgeted. If Paul hadn't been forced to search the train station for the weasel-like man, they could have arrived over an hour ago. But rather than complain about the delay, Captain Lechner had merely nodded from his place in the rear of the Grosser Mercedes and went back to reading his correspondence. Never had he seen an officer ignore a chance to dress down someone for the slightest inconvenience. A few instances of patience and graciousness back in Munich came to mind and proved Paul wrong. Uncomfortable with that, he returned his thoughts to the woman and her obvious terror. He'd have liked to reassure her. The blue-brown of the eyes haunted him. In another time, before the ugliness of war had encroached on their lives, he would have tried to make her smile, asked her to dine with him, tried to kiss her when he finally took her home at night, doing his best to avoid an irate father or brother. When would those days return? Paul shot his seat companion a sidelong look, but the man stared straight ahead.
He can't read your thoughts.
But the way things were going these days, it felt as though people could read even the hint of a disloyal thought. He wanted to believe in Hitler's desire to reunify all Germanic peoples. But how did an alliance with Italy serve that goal? Why would they fight against England? Questions, however, were verboten. A glimpse of a green roof flashed through the trees, and at almost the same moment he saw a tree trunk move. He frowned and glanced again. Nothing. It couldn't. But there it was again, in his side mirror. This time he recognized the movement. Someone running between the trees on his right. Was that hat? It was. A rich red beret, just like the woman had worn. How had she gotten out here so quickly? And better yet, why? The drive appeared before he could ponder the question further, and Paul pulled the car in and parked in front of the great doors leading into the chateau. It was a pretty building. Baroque, of course. So many of the old places had been redesigned in that style in the last couple of centuries. At least the yellow and wood mingled with a green roof instead of a red one. The half-timber facade gave it a familiar hominess despite its obvious grandeur. After opening the captain's door, Paul watched Herr Werner. Anyone looking would see a calm, rigid man. But Paul had sensed unease growing until he felt as though Herr Werner would come undone. Now, standing in front of the house, the man's temples broke out in perspiration. But why?
Pleased to be home, Herr Werner?
Captain Lechner seemed to mock the man as he strode to the door and banged on the knocker. A maid, somewhere in her 20s, he surmised, opened the door and welcomed them in.
The Freifrau is in the sitting room. If you'll follow me.
Freifrau? This woman was a baroness. How had he not caught that bit of information?
Not in her husband's study? I would have thought it her favorite room now.
The maid blanched and turned to lead them through. Her, I wouldn't know, was nearly drowned by the captain's laughter echoing in the foyer. Why hadn't he been assigned to one of the Oberleutnants in Munich? Yes, being assigned to Lechner might be considered an honor, but was it really? Time would tell. Mina Gongol rose to greet them.
Captain, you honor us with your visit.
The maid shot a look at her mistress, which left Paul curious. Without a word, she fired another look at Werner, a scowl, really, and scurried from the room. He didn't have time to ponder it before Lechner began introducing them.
His husband chose to run rather than fight for the fatherland.
The beautiful woman poured schnapps for both of them and hesitated at Werner. Her gaze rose to Lechner and waited for instructions. Lechner laughed again, and the sound began to grate on Paul's nerves.
You are not accustomed to serving your butler, Mina?
Was it his imagination, or did she stiffen at the use of her Christian name? Or was it the mention of a butler? The Freifrau pulled another goblet forward and poured. She brought it forward.
It is good to see you again, Herr Werner. You are well?
Herr Werner had been their butler. Paul eyed the captain over the rim of the goblet and wondered what the man had in mind. He still didn't know why they had to drive across the country, or take a train in this case, to visit a chateau in the middle of nowhere. If it turned out to be a rendezvous with a mistress, he'd do anything he could to get transferred, even if it meant demotion. Lechner stroked the woman's cheek with the back of his hand before patting it with enough force to make her blink.
She's been of much help to me, proving her loyalty to der Führer.
Those fingers trailed down her arm.
And her loyalty to me.
Of course, Captain.
Only when the captain turned away to settle near the fire and began asking questions about the arrival of some children did the woman's placid expression show any emotion at all. The problem was, Paul couldn't decipher it. With everything settled, he excused himself to bring in the luggage. The woman nodded at him.
Hetty will show you which rooms are prepared for you.
To Captain Lechner she added,
I assume Hetty will have readied Herr Werner's previous quarters for him, but would you prefer he be placed closer to you?
Oh, shove him out of the way, why don't you? I know you want to put him back in his place.
The man's laughter didn't affect Werner's countenance at all, but the lady gave a light laugh.
You'll know where to find your rooms then, Werner, won't you?
And in that moment, Herr Werner must have been seething. Chapter 7. First, the banging on the door, then the woman running off to the woods, then another banging, the Freifrau returning, the SS officer and his Oberleutnant, captain, and the other man. What was happening today? Were they here to take him and Grete away? Surely the military had better things to do than organize the deportation of children. Yes, like enforcing laws about who could live where. After ordering Grete's silence, Hans crept downstairs, listening and watching as he went. He hid behind a tall statue near the door to the sitting room and listened, but he didn't hear much. Instead, he followed Hetty to the kitchen to see what he could learn there. Finding the hidden door to the butler's pantry the previous evening had seemed interesting, but of no consequence at the time. Now, he slipped through the dining room, past the study, beyond a large room that he didn't know the purpose of, and through the hidden door into the large, airy room full of dishes and silver. He'd even found a perfect place to hide where he could hear everything said in the kitchen.
Nasty Werner is back. If he pinches me just once, I'll slap him this time.
Frau Bauer tutted.
He'll do nothing of the sort. He's with those Nazis. Do you remember what happened the last time that man came? Do you want to be the one lying in your own blood on the floor? Don't be silly.
Lying in blood?
Well, I can want to, can't I?
The women tittered, so Hetty couldn't have been quite as offended as she pretended, could she?
Take these out to the guests and see how the Freifrau is doing. It can't be easy with the man who killed her husband just sitting in her own room. The animal.
Shh. Hetty hefted a tray with an exaggerated groan, but her warning was clear.
Don't let them hear you say one thing against them, or...
A mocking tone entered her voice.
You'll be the one lying on the floor in your own blood this time.
The snap of a kitchen towel and a squeal followed with Frau Bauer accusing the maid of being saucy. Hans crept out of the pantry and made for the servants' stairs. After Hetty left, he wouldn't learn anything more. Better to hurry back to Grete and warn her to be extra quiet. At least her coughing had settled down to nearly nothing. As he neared the top of the second flight, a loud sound reverberated through the chateau. Hans froze, torn between running toward the obvious gunshot to see if someone needed help and getting far away from the gun. The thought of Grete upstairs and alone, scared, or worse, curious, decided for him. Movement to his right as Hans reached the hallway showed a black uniform heading down the main staircase. He knew that uniform. His mother feared the SS more than anyone. He scrambled up the final stairs to the attic and slowed as everything darkened. A sniffle from Greta's room prompted him to grab the box torch and flick it on before he stepped inside.
It's all right. It's all right. I heard,
The girl shook.
like, the night Vati died. Loud.
Several choice words came to mind, ones he hadn't tried out yet, but saying them in front of Greta would never do.
Shh, it's all right.
The girl flew from the bed and at him.
I want to go home. Can't we run away? Hide on a train? Go back to our mooties?
Her arms squeezed tight.
I'm scared.
He'd never admit that he was just as scared, but as moments turned into seconds, and then into a minute, his fear of being shot became an overwhelming unease of being accused of it. Who had it been? Who had done it? What if the captain had shot the Freifrau? What if Hetty had shot the Werner they so despised? What if the SS officer were running away from someone instead of toward someone?
What's happening?
I don't know, little one. He patted her head. But it was cruel, but being taken away so no one could take care of her was just as cruel. He led her back to the bed and sat down beside her. Listen, I have to hide.
What did you do?
Hans jumped up again and paced, the light of the box torch swinging all over the walls. Nothing, but they might not believe that, so... The idea came to him in a flash. Listen carefully. The child's face was white, eyes wide in the light of the box torch.
I'll try.
I was here with you when we both heard the shot, together. Hans moved closer, his gaze locked on hers. Do you hear me? I was here. I ran out to see what happened when we heard it. Now tell me, where is the boy? You say, he continued, unable to hide the panic rising within him. I don't know. He came to check on me. We heard the shot. He ran out and told me to stay. Now say it. After 2 repetitions, he squeezed her hand and dashed out, down the hall, all the way to the unused attic rooms. Only when he neared did he stop short and move slower. Were people there? Watching? Waiting? But the rooms were empty. The wait began. At first he paced. Then he turned on the box torch and began examining every corner of the room for a hidden knob or panel. Muffled noises from downstairs drove him to keep searching long past any hope of finding something. The screeches, the shouts, and what sounded like sobbing sent him halfway down the hallway twice before reason sent him back again. He needed to find somewhere to hide. There just wasn't anywhere. Under a bed would have to do. If only he had a blanket to hang down the sides. That thought caught his imagination. On the other side of the chateau, a linen closet was tucked into the corner between the doors and the stairwell. Perhaps. Hans crept from the room, one eye on the hallway, both ears listening for the slightest movement. At the stairwell, he found it. An identical closet, and inside, a stack of blankets. Well, he'd use them to hide with, and then he'd take them to their rooms to keep them warmer. If Hetty checked the closet down there, she wouldn't be missing anything and maybe wouldn't notice. When his shoe made a thud that sounded like an explosion to his ears, Hans removed both shoes and tucked them under the bed. Then he draped blankets over each bed, allowing the sides to hang almost to the floor. The one by the door, it would hide him if no one looked closely. Just to be certain, Hans crawled under and laid with his back against the wall. He could see just a hint of light through the crack of the door jamb, but with the darkness in the room, he didn't think he'd see shoes well. Maybe that would be good for him. Maybe that meant someone wouldn't see him there. His head whacked the underside of the cot. Stifling a sneeze, Hans reached up to see what had poked him in the head and found a pencil wedged between the springs. As he pulled it out, the sound of tearing paper caught his attention. Extricating that paper proved harder. After several false attempts that only tore things further, Hans moved the mattress off the bed and managed to pry an odd-looking bundle of papers from between the strings without too much more damage. Though he promised himself he'd wait until it was safe to examine the papers, curiosity won out over prudence, and he crept along the hall, over to the narrow window near the stairs. The papers were scraps, an envelope opened up, an end page from a book, fine writing paper, butcher's paper. It had all been sewn together with dark thread and clumsy stitches, and on nearly every page, large, nearly illegible writing. Lost in the wonder of finding a secret, Hans forgot everything and began reading. There are 10 of us, 7 girls and 3 boys. The woman put us up in this dark place and left the light on, but the maid is coming back to turn it off later. One of the girls has been here for 3 weeks. She was sick, and the woman wouldn't let her go on the trains. I want to go home, but Elsa says it isn't safe anymore. With Muti and Fati dead, she can't take care of me. She's working with a... The word made no sense, but Hans thought he understood. She thinks she'll be caught. She didn't say so, but I know it. The sound of boots storming up the steps sent Hans scrambling for his hiding place. The cot creaked as he bumped it, and he almost squeaked his surprise. I must find another place to hide. This isn't going to work. The footfalls stopped outside the door opposite his. A minute passed before they moved closer. A growl followed when a hand couldn't find a switch or a pull chain. A head whacked against the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. Please don't have matches. The urge to sneeze overtook him again. Hans pinched the bridge of his nose and tried to breathe slowly, just as they had when playing hide and seek in the alleys near his home. It would only work for so long. Then he'd produce a nasal explosion that would bring anyone within a mile radius running to see what had happened. Well, that couldn't happen this time. It just couldn't. Grete depended on him. The feet stormed out of the room, louder than Hans would have thought necessary. But the footfalls didn't grow quieter at all. Was the man just marching in place? Why? The answer to that question struck a blow to his gut. He thinks he'll catch someone if they're hiding in here. But what Dummkopf would... Another answer. A child. A boy. He's looking for me. Delft blue and white against rich mahogany. Thick carpets. Heavy drapes with sheer silk curtains. The carved bed looked designed for a king. Paul had never seen such a beautiful room. Just the one bedroom was half the size of his mother's entire flat in Munich. Werner would bring up their bags in due time, so Paul decided to wash his face and hands, get the grime of the trip off him, and then maybe wander around the grounds for a few minutes. He glanced out the window at the gardens below the terrace and out into the woods surrounding the chateau. Once more, he saw the flash of brown among the trees and frowned. Maybe a walk first, then a wash. It didn't make sense that a woman would be wandering in the forests of Kuchel and just happen to arrive at the same place he did. Was she following me? Was that why she looked so terrified? Is she part of a resistance? The coat seemed to be moving closer. Well, then perhaps she had business at the chateau after all. Despite that, he reached for the boots he'd removed upon entering the room and brushed the dirt off before pulling each one on and inspecting them. He wouldn't give Lechner a reason to reprimand him if he could avoid it. But before he could reach for his coat, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot rang out. Paul hesitated for only half a second before racing for the stairs. The beauty of the Chateau Versteck that had captured his attention on the way up to his room blurred into nothingness as he flew down the stairs and into the foyer. Herr Werner burst in through the front door. Hetty, ahead of him, pushed open the door to the sitting room, screamed and fainted, her head cracking on the floor. From somewhere to his right, Mina Gongol appeared and demanded to know what that dreadful noise was.
Why is Hetty on the floor? What happened to her?
A round woman pushed past them all against a stirring Hetty, but not before giving the lady of the house a curious look. Interesting. What does that mean? But before he could think about it, his gaze landed on the prone body of Captain Franz Lechner. At that exact moment, Herr Werner stiffened and cried out,
"The captain's been shot!"
And so he had. A gun lay beside the man's hand as if he'd dropped it, but no one could have shot themselves in the back like that. Unless he shot himself in the chest? It seemed unlikely that the gun would be at his side if he fell forward, though. But what did he know about how things looked when people shot themselves? As ranking officer now, it was his duty to discover what had happened, and as far as he could see, someone had shot an officer of the Third Reich. Murder. Treason, most likely. And he scanned the room. One of these people may be guilty. Herr Werner knelt by the body, but Paul ordered him back. "Don't disturb anything. I need to think."
"But he
is clearly dead." But the housekeeper frowned.
"Or unconscious. At least check him."
Mina agreed. "You must. My Albert lived for a minute or two after he—" she swallowed hard. "Was shot." Conceding, Paul stepped forward, swallowed his revulsion, and tried to feel for a pulse. Wrist, neck. An attempt to turn him over only showed a pool of blood that seeped around his boot. He'd been right. The captain is dead. He stepped back, his mind trying to sort out what to do next. Someone moved closer, and that decided for him. "Everyone, leave the room. Go into the hallway and stay there." He turned to the Freifrau. "Do you have a key to this room?" The housekeeper pulled a ring from her pocket and fumbled through it.
"I do. Here it is,"
she said as she handed him a large, old-fashioned key. It wouldn't do much to keep out someone determined to get into the room. "Thank you." Despite its ineffectiveness, Paul locked the door behind him. As he turned to face the group, he saw Herr Werner turning to leave. "Wait. I have questions for you all. Stay where you are." That was when he remembered the woman in the brown coat. The temptation to swear nearly overrode his reticence. "I need everyone into another room. Which one would be best?" This time he addressed himself to the housekeeper.
"Freiherr Gangel's study, perhaps, although—"
The Freifrau wilted.
"No," she gasped. "Please."
Without hesitation, the housekeeper nodded.
"Excellent thought, ma'am. There wouldn't be enough seating. Perhaps the dining room."
As much as he hated to do it, Paul came to a swift decision. "Herr Werner, take the group to the dining room and keep them there. No one is to leave, do you understand?"
"I should—"
Paul cut him off. "Do you understand, Herr Werner?" The man nodded, and just to be certain that he obeyed, Paul added, catching the gaze of each person, "I want to know if anyone steps out of sight for any reason." Each person nodded, and Paul turned.
"Where are you going?"
"I saw someone in the woods. It could be our murderer." Another thought occurred to him. "Are there other servants here? A cook? A gardener?" Mia Gongol shook her head.
"They've all gone, either to serve the Reich or because of ancestry."
The word hung in the air, awkward and unnerving. Herr Werner stiffened and nearly spat out the now hated word.
"Juden."
"So, everyone in the house is present here?"
"Except the children,"
the maid said.
"Yes."
"Children?" When the Freifrau couldn't speak, the housekeeper answered.
"They come sometimes to be put on the Kindertransport. We have 2 right now. A little girl who is quite ill, and a boy. Small for his age, but he is 11.
A nod from the maid and the lady of the house confirmed the boy's age. "And how old is the girl?"
5, but she is very undersized."
The housekeeper scowled at him.
"They both are."
Her unspoken, "too young to shoot anyone," rang out clearly, but Paul couldn't risk making assumptions. Could a boy of 11 shoot a gun? And where had the gun come from? He didn't know. Another question to explore, but after he found the woman and brought her inside to be questioned with the rest. Chapter 8. Paul had made it to the grand entrance when an idea occurred to him. He took the stairs 2 at a time and went from room to room, peering out windows and scanning the grounds for any sign of movement. Just as he considered giving up and going back to the assembled potential witnesses, he thought he saw something off to the right.
You can't hide forever, Fraulein.
Taking note of a tall fir tree near a garden pavilion off in the distance, he took off for the ground floor and raced out the door. The whole idea of him thundering around through the forest and gardens as if he knew a thing about investigating murder sent ripples of unease through him. But what else could he do? He'd be held accountable for the captain's death unless he could prove who did it. Wouldn't he? Once he reached the fir, Paul stopped and listened. Wind whistled through the branches, blowing leaves off beech and poplar trees and whooshing through the evergreens. A bite in the air hinted at snow coming, but he heard nothing out of place. No fabric brushing against a tree trunk, no twigs snapping or leaves crunching. When minutes passed with nothing but the flash of a deer's tail as it darted away, Paul tramped back to the chateau. With each step, he tried to remember what the detective had done in the mystery novel his mother had read to him when he'd had pneumonia a few years earlier. Question the witnesses, find alibis, narrow down, look for motive. What else? That was the problem. He'd fallen asleep nearly every time she started reading and had probably only heard half the story. But maybe it was a place to begin. Perhaps. Not everyone sat in the dining room. Werner and the Freifrau sat, but the housekeeper and maid stood in the corner. Why had the housekeeper chosen a room with plenty of seating only to stand at attention? It didn't make sense. That decided for him. He'd start with her. Frau. Paul gave her a pointed look.
Bauer. Herr, Stutzstaffel,
He interrupted before her face could become any redder, and Herr Werner lashed out at her. He needed cooperation, not more fear.
Bitte, Frau Bauer, if you would come with me. I have a few questions.
Werner tried to protest, but Paul shot him a silencing glare. Outside the dining room, Paul asked where the most comfortable place for them to chat would be.
You sound like you're suggesting a quiet conversation over coffee.
If we could go in the kitchen.
Jäger, Scharführer, Paul Jäger.
Yes.
She avoided echoing him and gestured toward the back corner of the chateau.
I have stew and spätzle to attend. It will be ruined.
Perfect. Perhaps if she were in a comfortable place doing familiar things, the housekeeper would relax. He found a chair in the kitchen and asked if he might be seated. Flustered, the woman flapped her hands at him and went to stir the stew.
Where were you when you heard the gunshot?
Right here.
The woman shot him a look that questioned his competence.
I have to ask the obvious, Frau Bauer. I don't know any of you or what you do.
And I don't know a thing about investigating a murder. That thought sent him reeling. Yes, that was exactly what he'd been pushed into. Investigation like a floundering, pathetic attempt at being a detective.
Of course. Would you like coffee, Scharführer? Vanilla Kipfer?
Both would be appreciated. Thank you. Who was with you here in the kitchen? The maid?
Hetty? No. She'd already left to bring the coffee tray.
The woman turned to look at him.
What happened to that tray? She didn't drop it. We would have seen.
I will ask her.
Excitement welled up in him. Upon consideration, Hetty's revival after fainting had been swift. He eyed the round woman's shoulders and repeated himself.
I will ask her, Frau Bauer.
Of course.
The woman began mixing flour and salt and cracking eggs. Now, he watched with nostalgic interest. His mother had made spätzle often, and he'd loved to snitch the noodles the moment they came out of the pot.
You gave the Freifrau an odd look when she came into the room.
Why was that? The woman's lips tightened before she sighed and shook her head.
Did I?
A man has been murdered, Frau Bauer. Someone here has killed. If I don't find out who, and the person who did it fears you know something, you could be next. Unless you killed an officer you couldn't have known. When it looked as if the woman would still resist, Paul sighed and picked up the sugar-dusted cookie. I could arrest you for non-cooperation. Perhaps.
It was just shock, Scharführer. It probably brought back terrible memories is all.
The woman fidgeted now, unable to mix the noodles but equally unable to look at him.
But she asked what the noise had been.
Now the housekeeper turned and stared right at him.
But she would know. She was just outside the door when that man shot the Freiherr. She would surely know the sound. I think she didn't want to know.
The woman said with a shudder.
Who would?
Captain Franz Lechner shot Albert Gangl? The housekeeper didn't waver this time. She fixed a look at him that would quell a man devoid of all fear and said,
He did, in the back, as he went to say goodbye to the Freifrau.
The captain had come to press Herr Gangl into service?
Yes, but he refused, chose the camp at Sachsenhausen instead.
Frau Bauer's eyes darkened to a black blue as she added,
Her grief made the Freifrau lose her baby as well.
Motive for Mina Gangl. He'd have to pay attention there. But the housekeeper seemed to have no love for the captain herself. May I assume you would not be sorry to see the captain dead? The round chin jutted up and out, eyes flashed, shoulders squared.
I would not. I am not. That man murdered the Baron. Murdered. I'm not sorry he's dead, but...
She pierced him with that gaze.
I did not do it. Nor did Hetty or the Freifrau. That leaves you or Werner.
And the Kinder.
Do you think they would know where to find a gun, much less how to use it? Be sensible.
He was sensible. A boy of 11 could be strong enough if he'd had practice. The girl, not likely. He ran over the things he needed to ask in his mind. Where she'd been, motive, who could corroborate her account of her whereabouts. The problem was the woman had motive and had no alibi. She'd been on the scene when he arrived, hadn't she? Where would be the best place to interview Herr Werner? That caught the woman's interest and disgust. You don't like him, do you?
He abandoned us here without a word after the Anschluss. The Freiherr and the Freifrau returned with just us, trying to keep things in order. Then he returns and is all hochnassig again.
So the man had already been uppity with them. Interesting. And I should question him where?
His room. Perhaps you'll discover something that proves him guilty.
Perhaps he would. As he rose, one last question came to mind. Frau Bauer, one more thing. Have you seen a woman around the chateau, wearing a brown coat, hiding in the trees? But the woman just shook her head.
We have no near neighbors. It is probably a deer or a bear.
Paul believed her. Not that he'd seen a deer or a bear, but that she believed it to be so. Just to test himself, he added, Unless they've taken to wearing red berets, I doubt it. Wide-eyed, Frau Bauer stared first at him and then out the window.
Do you think a woman killed the captain?
It might have been crazy, but Paul would have been willing to bet that the housekeeper would have thanked their woodland Fraulein if she could have. They had to move the body from the sitting room floor. Paul had no doubt of that, but frankly, he didn't want to. He had to find out who had done this and then call for reinforcements. But the interviews had done nothing to narrow down his suspects. Mina Gangl had admitted to knowing what a gunshot sounded like, but as Frau Bauer had suggested, she'd been too shocked to think clearly. It was plausible, but The woman had motive, the strongest motive of anyone there. If Lechner had killed her husband and caused the loss of her baby, the woman could be deranged for all he knew. The only interesting bit of information he'd retrieved was that a young woman, Lena Weiss from Kuchel, had brought their telegram not long before they'd arrived. Perhaps the woman he'd seen as they drove up the road to the chateau? The tray that had confused Frau Bauer had been located on a table outside the door to the sitting room. Hetty insisted that she set it down in order to open the door, heard the shot, panicked for a moment, and then rushed in to see the captain lying on the floor. She didn't remember anything after that. As to motive, hers seemed even less tenuous than the housekeeper's. If I were going to kill any of you, it would have been that Lutzkreis Werner. Herr Werner insisted he had been coming downstairs from his rooms and had neither seen nor heard anything. No one had seen him. He had no reason to kill the captain. Paul needed to let him go now and report the murder. On and on the simple, plain statements followed each question. As a precaution against escape, Paul locked the man in his room. Epithets followed him as he moved to the other side of the house to where Hetty had explained he'd find the children. The darkness surprised and alarmed him. If the little girl were ill, no wonder. Cold and dark? Colder with every step away from the blazing fires in every other occupied room. At the top of the stairs, he saw what must have been the domed roof caps, but no lights. He turned back to retrieve a flashlight, but the women in the kitchen assured him that Hans had the only one in the house. "I think there might be one in the garage, on the shelf," the housekeeper added. "Hetty could. I'll go." After asking for more explicit directions, he hurried out to the garage and noted the gleaming Mercedes parked there. He found the shelf the housekeeper had told him of, but he saw no flashlight at all. Closer inspection hinted that one might have been there until recently. The dust looked disturbed and bare in places. Then again, it could have been a wrench or a hammer. He dug through the captain's car and found a large flashlight that glowed in the darkening shadows. This investigation, now that sundown was nearly here, would become a nightmare. Snapping it off, Paul once again took the stairs up to the attic rooms and stepped into the one Hetty said would hold the children. When he swept the light across the room, he saw a small child huddled in the bed, blankets wrapped so closely around her that he couldn't see much more than her eyes. "Grete." The girl blinked. "My name is Paul Jäger. I came to see if you were safe." Should he mention the shot? He didn't know. "I thought the loud noise might have frightened you." Though she shook her head, Greta's wide eyes hinted that she was most definitely terrified. Paul tried again. "What about the boy, Hans? Is he safe?" This time, though the eyes grew even wider, if that were possible, she gave a single, decided nod. "That is good, very good. I must speak with him, ask him what he knows about what happened. Do you know where he is?" The swift shake of the head could mean anything from "I don't" to "I wouldn't tell you on pain of death or no dinner." "Ah, Marseber. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. There were Vanillekipferl in the kitchen. Would you like me to bring one back with me?" After a tiny hesitation, she nodded. Paul made it to the door before he heard her sniffle. He turned and caught her wiping her eyes. "What's wrong? Are you cold?" Greta nodded and sniffled again.
Mutti calls me Knuddelmoss. I want my Mutti."
The sniffle became tears. He waffled between rushing down and back and just taking her with him. The latter came with the possibility of comfort from Frau Bauer, so he came to lift her. "I think you could be a good helper. I'll carry you down for tea in Vanillekipferl, but you must carry the light." Without giving her a chance to protest, he lifted her. Paul might be a bachelor with little experience with children, but even he could tell she was too thin. The little girl who lived down the hallway from his Mutti must weigh twice what this little bird did. I heard you had a fever, he said as they reached the next floor. Greta just nodded. But you don't feel too warm now. Do you feel better? After a much too long pause, she relaxed a bit and wrapped an arm around his neck.
It comes back at night. I sleep a long time. Hans sits with me.
Then, as if an afterthought, she added,
But I feel better. Not so achy.
That is good to hear. Light as she was, he felt her weight by the time they reached the ground floor. Now, I'll leave you for tea and cookies with Frau Bauer and go talk to Hans. Where did you say he is? The girl's mouth opened, shut with a snap, and opened again. He isn't in trouble. I must find out where he was. Make certain he is safe. This seemed to relax her.
He left when he heard the shot.
Greta looked confused. She gazed at him and tried to explain.
Hans said it was a shot. Was it? Did someone get hurt?
Someone got hurt very badly, which is why I must find out what happened. So, Hans was with you when you heard the shot? Greta bobbed her head.
Yes.
There was just one thing about that answer. No longer would the girl meet his eyes, and ever since he'd offered vanilla kipferl, Greta had watched him as if hungry for attention. Now she repelled it. Frau Bauer looked up as they entered the kitchen.
Is our little Greta feeling better?
She is, Paul said, but she's also feeling hungry and lonely. As he caught the woman's gaze, he gave an almost imperceptible nod. I need to make sure the boy is safe too. Cookies and tea by the fire, perhaps? Hetty sailed in and froze.
What's she doing in here? We'll all be sick.
What else Hetty might have said died in the maid's throat as Frau Bauer shushed her and took Greta from him. He hesitated at the door, making certain they'd treat the child well, before rushing off to search for Hans. That boy had not been in the room with Greta when the gun went off. Chapter 9. The trap was set. Paul stood in the doorway of Greta's room and stared. Was it too cruel? The boy was a child. However, if Hans had killed the captain, he was also a murderer. But why would a boy kill the captain? Motive seemed tenuous, but it did seem plausible that a boy might see any person in authority as responsible for his being sent away. But why the captain so quickly after he arrived? Why not kill the Freifrau or me? Where would he have found a gun? Then again, he was a Jew. Some would say Hans was guilty because of his mere existence. Every day, more trains headed to Poland, the expulsion of Juden from the fatherland. For Germany's protection, it was said. But regardless of what threat the Jews might pose for Germany and the Reich, it didn't make an 11-year-old boy guilty of murder. And yet, if I don't find out who is, Herr Werner will ensure that Hans is found guilty, if only to ensure the removal of one more Jew from Austria. Paul left the children's dormitory area and took off for the other side of the house. Herr Werner might be der Widerlicher, but, sleazy or not, it didn't make him automatically guilty of anything, and he needed the man's help. They couldn't leave the captain lying on the sitting room floor. The blood would stain, and the body would begin to decay. They needed to move him to the cellar, or even the garage, as cool as days and nights were now. But when he opened the door to Herr Werner's room, he found the window open and the room empty. Though he stood at the window and scanned the woods and area, it was too dark to see anything. Paul pounded the wall next to the window before taking off. How the man managed to climb out the window and down 3 stories, he didn't know, but that was a problem to solve later. Now he had to find his likely prime suspect, Werner. Running nearly guaranteed the man's guilt. He'd also have to deal with the relief that came at the proof of Hans's innocence later. In the kitchen, he ordered Frau Bauer to keep Greta downstairs and in sight at all times.
Stay together. Guard the Freifrau. Herr Werner has escaped.
Hetty stepped in from a side room and glowered.
I knew it had to be him. I knew it. I didn't. Frau Bauer didn't. The mistress wouldn't. So it had to be him.
Just to test his theory, Paul added, or the boy.
Ha! I don't think so. I don't like having them here. It's more work for us when we're overworked as it is, but even I know he didn't.
With the women protected as much as he could manage, Paul let himself out the back door, flicked on the flashlight, and swept it over the grounds. He could try stealth, or he could act like he assumed the man was trying to help. Considering the undergrowth in the forest, he'd never hide his approach well. Better to tackle the issue head on.
Herr Werner? Where are you? What did you see? Did you find something?
On he trudged across the gardens and into the forest surrounding the chateau.
Werner! What made you risk falling to come out here? Did you find who did it? Werner!
The more dense the trees became, the harder it was for Paul to hope to see anything. He heard nothing. Even the leaves and the needles ceased to whisper their secrets as if they sensed danger. Paul might have turned back, tried to look on the other side of the garage or up by the road, but movement somewhere to his right sent him running toward it. Running, between dense tree growth with roots and slick leaves beneath his feet, proved difficult. And when his foot caught on a particularly large root, he went flying, head first, into a tree. Dazed, Paul sat up and scanned the floor for the flashlight. A few feet ahead, it glowed, half buried in the leaves. He scrambled for it and brushed off mud and half-decayed vegetation as he picked it up. The beam flickered between the trees as he panned the area. That's when the light picked up a familiar bit of brown. His gut clenched when moving the beam upward showed a red beret clinging to soft, honey-brown hair.
Werner, where are you? Who is this woman?
His answer came with an explosion of light behind his eyes, and then darkness. The urge to sneeze returned for the third time. He'd never managed to repress it forever, and if he did sneeze, it needed to be where he could run, not trapped under a bed. After flipping back the blanket, he rolled out from under the cot and took care to be as quiet as possible as he stood. 1 step toward the door. 2. A pier around it showed nothing. From the doorway, he still saw nothing. He had a choice. Sprint for Greta's room or creep between doorways. Hans listened. A bang downstairs sent him flying to a room on the opposite side of the house. From the window, he saw a silhouette cross the terrace and race down through the gardens. But a check on Greta showed her bed empty. He crept to the stairs and down to the next floor, holding his breath half the time. His mind told him it was ridiculous, but he couldn't help himself. He had to be quiet. If they caught him, they'd blame him. Why he knew that, Hans couldn't have explained, but he had no doubt it was true. On the ground floor, he hesitated before dashing down the hall and peering into the dining room. Empty. Perfect. He crept along the hidden door and pulled the latch that hid behind a slightly raised pocket in the wall. The door swung open and whisper silent. Hans peered into the crack and saw no one in the room with all the dishes, so he slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The women were talking about him, and Greta.
Scharführer is looking for Werner. He'll find the traitor.
He's looking for Hans, too.
Well, Hans should have been in his room,
Hetty snapped. Frau Bauer would have none of that.
He probably went out to play and got turned around in the trees. He'll be back soon, little mouse.
To Hetty, she added,
The boy was told to walk around in the fresh air to keep from catching her fever. Don't scold him for inconvenient obedience.
Scolding for inconvenient obedience. He felt as though half his school days were filled with children being scolded for that very thing. But Hetty drowned out his musings with a half-asked question.
Do you think he's looking for Hans for...
The harumph Frau Bauer gave could mean anything.
I knew these children were more trouble than they're worth. The sooner the, sugar comes, the better.
We'll take care of the kinder as if they belonged here, and we won't begrudge them the very little time they take. They don't ask for much, and it isn't their fault they've come. Shameful attitude, Hetty. Most shameful.
But Hetty didn't cower.
Well, if Werner had his way, they'd be off to Poland on the next train.
Until then, they are our responsibility. Speaking of which, Greta could use a nice hot bath and clean clothes. Hans hasn't bathed her, not that he should, and she's been feverish.
There, Hans agreed. Greta had been smelling a little ripe for the last day or so, but feeding, comforting, and escorting her to the washroom had been beyond his responsibilities as it was. He'd refused even to mention a bath in case the women told him to do it. When Frau Bauer lifted the lid to the large pot on the stove, the scent of a rich, hearty stew wafted his way. His stomach growled, and he moved back, ready to run, but the women didn't respond. Another peer through the crack in the door showed Greta looking his way. He opened it just a bit and held his fingers to his lips.
Well, come on, Greta. If you're to have a bath, we need to do it quickly. Frau Bauer forgets that I'm the only one here to help her.
Hans sneaked out of the butler's pantry, hurried back through the dining room, and listened as Hetty blathered on about what a hassle it was to bathe before dinner.
The Freifrau likes a bath before dinner, too. You'll be like a grand lady, and I'll have to wait on you hand and foot. But you don't like me.
Hetty stopped still and stared down at the little girl.
That's not true, Greta. I don't like more work, but you've been a good girl, and I'm sorry I complained. Let's get you clean and comfortable, and I'll set you and Hans a table for dinner tonight. No more fever is good, yes? If the bad man doesn't get Hans, he doesn't like either of us. He'll try to blame Hans for the captain getting shot, but I don't think the Scharführer will listen.
In an instant, Hans's mouth went dry. He froze in place and turned. He had to leave, now. But how? Where? Home? His Vati would help him hide from the Stutzstaffel. Yes, home. The women would care for Greta, so he must get away before this Werner or the SS officer captured him.
Hide on the train, or find Muti's money and take it back.
His conscience protested, but Hans justified the idea after consideration.
I did give it to the woman. Now, I'm taking it back since she doesn't have to care for me anymore. I took care of Greta for them, so that should cover my bed and meals.
But where would the woman have put it? Walking up the grand staircase might be risky, but Hans decided speed was more important than hiding when he knew the women were busy and at least one of the men were outside. It seemed logical anyway. The problem was, hiding also seemed logical, even if he had to sneak out at midnight or something. But no, he'd made his decision, and once decided, he'd stick to it. Outside the Freifrau's room, he listened and heard the unmistakable sounds of someone moving around inside. He sprinted back downstairs and tried the door to the sitting room, but found it locked. He searched each room, including a pleasant study overlooking the gardens, and found nothing. Then he began examining wall after wall, trying to find another hidden door to the sitting room. That didn't work. So instead, he went outside and examined the windows. One wasn't latched, but climbing through was harder than he'd thought. In the end, he found himself tumbling through and landing on his shoulder. Hans laid there, hidden by a sofa, and listened for the sound of running feet. None came. Finding a light proved difficult, but once Hans's eyes adjusted to the darkness, He found a lamp and felt for the chain. A warm glow filled the space nearest him. The search began. The lamp sat on a small desk, which seemed like a reasonable place for someone to keep a cash box. 4 small drawers held only things like scissors, pencils, an ink bottle, and envelopes. The narrow center drawer was full of paper and a letter opener. No money, no small packets, nothing. A sound outside made him jump and conk his head on the lamp. It tottered and toppled off the desk and onto the floor. It sounded like an explosion, but nothing broke. The light still glowed as if it had just decided to lie down for a rest. Hans rushed to set it upright and hid behind the couch again, but no one came. No voices cried out. Nothing. The occasional table had a small, empty drawer. The owner of such a grand house wouldn't hide valuables in the cushions, so Hans skipped the sort of places he might have stowed his own money. A small painting beside the fireplace reminded him of a story his father had read, one about a man who kept a safe hidden behind a painting. A quick peek showed nothing, and Hans relaxed. He'd never be able to open a safe. Then a glance around the room showed several other paintings, and he moved to check them. If he found a safe, he'd have to leave without the money. But if not, he'd wait and check the Freifrau's room while they ate dinner. But when he moved closer to the door, a yelp escaped before he could stop it. There, lying on the floor, was the corpse of the man who had been shot. Hans's stomach churned, and he felt a little weak. The man is dead. He can't hurt you. If only telling himself that would make a difference. He skirted the man by way of going around a large piano and over to a short wall of books. Peering closer, he began reading off the titles, hoping for something interesting like an adventure story or even a history book. Some history books were more exciting than any storybook. But he only saw dry books about philosophy, some scientific books about electricity, an atlas, and Hans peered closer. Mein Kampf! It looked just like the other one, the one upstairs in the woman's room. It only took a blink to prompt him to grab the book from the shelf and race over to the lamp, though he had to jump over the body he'd forgotten about. The queasy feeling returned as he sailed over. Under the lamp's light, he flipped to where the pages had been different, and there it was. The packet nestled between the pages where his name and Grete's name had been added. This time he noticed something. Beside all the other names was a tiny dot, but not next to his or Grete's. Hans flipped back one page, then another. Every page had lists of names with those same little dots next to each one. Another flip. He froze, staring at one name, Solomon Dottel. Next to that name was a slash mark. It was the only name with one, and Hans didn't understand why, but he didn't like it. After one last look at the name, he closed the book and replaced it on the shelf. He stashed the packet deep in his pocket and climbed back out the window. Only once he'd made it down and saw the lamp glowing did he realize he'd left it on. Still, he didn't have time to... No, he must. It would make someone suspicious if they saw that light, and if they found the packet missing. His success depended on no one knowing he'd been in there, which meant he must go back and turn off the light. The packet clinked against the windowsill as he climbed through, and it gave him an idea. Once inside, he untied it, slipped the Reichsmarks from it, and refolded it again. Anyone who knew what had been inside would know at once it wasn't the same, but in a hurry, if they didn't pick it up. By the time Hans crawled back out the window again, he was tired, hungry, and cranky. This time, he avoided the grand staircase in favor of the small, narrow one meant for servants, but he took the one opposite their rooms. If he couldn't get close enough, he'd steal a blanket to use as a coat, but he wanted his coat, needed it. He couldn't take the rest of his things this time, but a coat. maybe one of those blankets regardless, and his cap would keep him warm until he got aboard the train. That long walk back to Kuchel would be cold and miserable on an empty stomach, but he had to do it. He had to leave now before the SS officer found him and arrested him for murder.
Fatih will know what to do,
he reminded himself. If he had to repeat it every step of the way, then so be it.
But first, my coat and hat. Then a blanket. Then home.
Chapter 10. Paul Jaeger became aware of his own consciousness when his shivers intensified the pounding in his head. He blinked up at inky blackness and felt the first raindrop on his forehead. The next followed only a second later, and before he could sit up, they began at a steady, ever-increasing pace. He'd be soaked before he found his way out of the trees, if he found his way out. The flashlight was gone, presumably stolen by Herr Werner. He felt around the dirt and felt the woman's leg. Perhaps it was unmanly of him, weak even, but he shuddered. What was she doing in the woods? And had Werner really killed her? Had he truly clobbered an officer? It seemed impossible, and yet... He patted his pockets and found the matchbook he always carried. The flame burned out faster than he'd liked, and he used up every one of the half a package he had left. But he'd discovered enough to know one thing. The woman had been strangled with her own silk scarf. Two things, Paul decided. He'd also positively identified her as the woman on the train. No doubt about that. He was halfway to soaked when he decided his only hope to discovering which way to walk was to climb a tree and hope to see lights in one of the chateau's windows. Climb, with a pounding headache, halfway to hypothermia, and in the rain. The idea couldn't be more ludicrous. But climb he did. His hands slipped and tore. The sleeve of his jacket ripped as it caught on a broken branch, but still Paul climbed higher until he felt certain he'd die if he fell. Between the wind, the rain, and the darkness, finding that light proved nearly impossible, but at last he saw just a twinkle. Once, twice, he held his breath. If he saw it in the same spot again, and there it was. Only when he reached the ground and decided that he could only go a few yards before needing to reorient himself did Paul realize the worst of it. He'd have to climb a dozen trees, maybe more, before he could hope to be inside of the chateau. When he fell from the fourth tree he climbed, Paul lay stunned, his eyes unfocused and his head spinning. Trees blurred as they swayed in winds that grew stiffer with each passing minute. He couldn't risk climbing again, but he thought he'd seen the light directly ahead, close enough that he should be near the tree break. Forcing himself to stand and walk, however, was almost impossible. Only the promise of a hot bath and a warm fire had him reaching for the tree trunk and using it to help pull himself up again. Step by step he stumbled, swaying as he went, until he finally saw the trees thinning, but the light had gone. Thunder rumbled, and Paul nearly wept with relief. If a flash of lightning could just show the outline of the house for a moment. 3 seconds. 10. 15. 25. At 30, the lightning flashed and the distinctive shape of the round attic rooms appeared, silhouetted against the darkness in his peripheral vision. He turned left and began walking. 10 seconds. 20. 25. 1 second more and it flashed again. The house lit up and disappeared, but this time he saw a hint of the golden stucco in the flash. Paul tried to run and stopped himself when things began to sway. He grabbed onto a statue of a Greek woman wrapped in diaphanous stone. The sculptor had been brilliant in his ability to make it look so weightless despite the medium. He apologized for grabbing her and felt his face heat. What a Dummkopf! With the next flash, he saw that the terrace was closer than he'd expected. He could go around the side and through to the kitchen where his wet shoes and clothing wouldn't ruin the floors or carpets. And with the next flash that followed, a question he should have asked came to him. The housekeeper asked how children would know where to find a gun. Did that mean there is a pistol on the premises? If so, I need to know where it is. He neared the doors to the sitting room. A drawing room was more like it, and plowed forward. First, a bath and warmth before I'm forced to join Grete in the infirmary. The girl's wide blue-brown eyes, her honey-brown hair, the pitiful longing for her Mutti. Paul's heart constricted. No, it couldn't be. But even as he thought it, the similarities in features bombarded his memory. That poor child. This left more than one scenario. Had she come to the chateau to retrieve her daughter and been met with resistance and killed the captain? Had Herr Werner then found her and realized what she must have done? No, that didn't sound like Herr Werner. He'd be more likely to use her appearance as a way to get away with his own crime, and even the housekeeper seemed certain that he'd done it. Except that she insisted on the dining room with seating for all, and then didn't sit. One conundrum piled onto another until his head threatened to split in two. He most certainly had a concussion, and hard thinking wasn't helping. By the time he stumbled through the kitchen door, he could barely stay upright. Mrs. Bauer screamed and then gasped. "What happened to you?" Paul tried to tell her about getting whacked over the head, but one moment he saw the woman looming closer, and the next he saw nothing. Frau Bauer stood guard outside the bathroom where Paul Jaeger soaked to warm himself. Mina held a towel before the fire, turning it each time her arms grew tired. Eventually, the unmistakable sound of draining water reached them. Mina tossed the towel to Frau Bauer, who opened the door and thrust her hand through. "A hot towel. Tell us when you're ready for pajamas." Even as the woman spoke, Mina began toasting the soft woolen flannel pajamas her husband had loved on cold winter nights. Bottoms in one hand, shirt in the other, she let them spin one way and then the next, ready to toss those too.
If only Albert had allowed me to install those towel warmers we saw in Vienna.
Of course, those had required radiators that their bathrooms didn't have, but she'd wanted them anyway. And soon, a man would walk out of that bathroom wearing Albert's pajamas and robe. The housekeeper called for bottoms, and Mina threw them to her before retrieving the robe and beginning the tedious process of heating it too.
I should protest against Frau Bauer's ridiculous modesty. I am Freifrauer here.
"He'll need slippers," the woman said as Mina handed over the robe. Mina swallowed hard and scurried from the room. Albert's slippers. How often had she scolded him for wearing them all over the house and even out onto the terrace. Gauche, she'd called it. She'd give anything to see him wear them on a jaunt to Kuchel even, just once. She'd laugh this time instead of complain. Why had she always complained about every little thing?
You didn't complain about the captain's orders.
Her skin crawled at the memory of the man's threats, the ways she could buy his silence, the compromises she'd made to save herself from. What? Death? If it were only so easy. If she were only brave enough to do it. Things the captain had said returned to her. Things that had happened in her own house. She deserved to die as much as he had. And if Werner had really hit the SS officer, then surely they'd conclude he'd murdered Lechner as well. She and her staff would finally be free. No more threats. No more children. No more horrible messages begging for sugar. The slippers were right where Albert had left them, on his side of the bed, tucked half under the bed table. Mina clutched them to her chest, choked back a sob, and rushed to the officer's room. There she thrust them into Frau Bauer's hands and dashed to the door.
I'll bring tea and schnapps.
By the time she returned, Frau Bauer had forced the officer into bed and propped him up with pillows. A bowl of water sat in his lap, and the faithful housekeeper cleaned a wound from the man's head.
It had to be Werner, she was saying.
That was my thought. I just don't know how he climbed down 3 stories without killing himself.
Mina gave him a weak smile as she entered and set the slippers by the hearth.
He probably didn't. All he needed to do was drop to the balcony below and go in through the room below his.
She pointed to the house shoes.
If you need to be up and about, they may be the wrong size, but they'll keep your feet warm.
The pajamas fit well, so they may be perfect. Thank you for the loan.
She nodded in lieu of reply.
He has a nasty cut on his head. Should be seen by a doctor, but I doubt the telephone is operational.
The statement came out as a question, and Mina nodded again. It might be rude, but this man could be dangerous if she became too chatty. She didn't know how much the captain had told him about their arrangement, and she would not offer anything more than she must.
The boy, has he returned to his room?
That caught Mina's attention.
Hans, is he not there?
He went out to play,
the housekeeper explained. To the officer she added,
Now I'm worried about him. I fear he's gotten lost in the forest and with the storm.
Or run away, the man insisted. If he shot...
He didn't.
At the look on the SS officer's face, she frowned and tried again.
Scharführer.
Paul, please.
Paul. Such a nice, ordinary name. Something about it soothed.
Paul, thank you. I was just going to say that Hans couldn't have shot Captain Lechner. He didn't know where the gun was, and even if he had, he wouldn't have had the key to the desk drawer or how to get out of the room without being seen.
Frau Bauer's lips thinned before she dropped the cloth in the bowl and reached for a bandage.
There. It's cleaned anyway. It should be seen, but we'll have to hope it heals well without sutures.
She lifted the bowl and stepped back.
Are you feeling well enough to eat some stew, or would you prefer some toast and jam?
Stew would be most welcome.
The moment the woman left, Mina asked about Hans.
Why is he gone? Where has he gone? It's a horrible night out there, not fit for a man, much less a boy. Look at you. You were half drowned and frozen when you came in.
Well, it's far later than I would have imagined, so he could have reached shelter by now, I suppose. One of the other rooms in the house? An outbuilding? Kuchel?
Her heart pounded even as the blood drained from her face.
Kuchel? Why there?
If I were a boy and had killed a man, my first thought would be to get on a train and go home to parents who could help me figure out what to do next.
But he couldn't have any. And why? Hans had never met Captain Lechner and had no reason to want him dead.
Unlike you, who had good reason indeed.
Cold overtook her in an instant. Mina shivered and fought to hide her alarm, and likely failed as well. She decided to try for honesty. A novel idea for certain, but a necessary one, she thought.
I did hate him. I won't deny it. He killed the 2 people I loved most in the world, one with a single gunshot, the other because of it. I won't pretend that if I had ever prayed for anything, it would have been that someone would kill the beast.
But you deny pulling the trigger today.
Mina chose her words carefully. Protecting herself wasn't enough. She had to protect Hans, Grete, Hedy, and Frau Bauer.
Albert always wanted me to learn to shoot the gun. He said it would be safer for me when he had to go to Salzburg for business, but I refused to touch it. Horrible things, guns. I despise them.
She let that sink in for a moment before adding,
After Albert was murdered, I locked his gun away and haven't touched it since. Hans wouldn't know where the key is. Even Hedy and Frau Bauer don't.
Werner might remember, I suppose, but why he'd kill the man who probably paid him well to inform on us, I can't imagine. It had to have been someone else. As she waited for his reply, Mina thought of one more thing. Unless you did it yourself and chose to try to blame it on us. As an officer here, you have the highest authority, don't you?
Yet I am the one who was nearly killed while trying to find a murderer. After arranging her features to appear skeptical, Mina shook her head and turned to go.
So you say...
At the door, she added,
I'll go see about Hans. Would you like me to bring him to you if I find him?
Please. Chapter 11. The only thing that could have made Paul's throbbing head worse was blinding sunlight, which, thanks to a continued storm, was still hidden behind the gray clouds. The pattering rain on the windows was nearly as obnoxious, and Paul ached to roll over and go back to sleep. In truth, he just ached in general. But a rumbling stomach and the memory of promised stew that he knew he hadn't eaten told him that he'd likely fallen asleep. Had Mina Gongol found the boy? Had Captain Lechner's body lain in the locked room all evening? Had Herr Werner returned? A dozen more questions bombarded his thoughts, but something he thought he should remember, something important, taunted him from the periphery, unwilling to enter as a conscious, rational thought. He swung his feet over the side of the bed and hesitated, waiting for the swimming sensation that had plagued him every time he moved. Sleep seemed to have dealt with that problem, but the hunger lingered, and thirst followed. Only the tiniest bit of tea remained in the cup, but the room had an attached bathroom, so Paul pulled on the dressing robe and shuffled his way across the floor and into the room for a drink. After draining 2 cups of water, he shuffled back to the bed and hesitated. Did he have the strength to dress and walk downstairs to find something to eat? Perhaps. But surely the food would make up for some of the exertion. I'm schwach wie eine Flasche leer, Paul muttered. Maybe the food will fill that bottle. He compromised by skipping the dressing when he couldn't find his clothes, but by the time he reached the ground floor, Paul felt like he'd been emptied out all over again. How you could empty an already empty bottle, he didn't know. Since when do I examine idioms and reconstruct them? That conch on my head affected me more than I realized. Frau Bauer met him at the door, holding onto his arm and almost dragging him into a chair. You shouldn't be walking around. We would have come with a tray soon. On and on she fussed as she scooped Hopple-Popple onto a plate and set it before him. You eat that while I make you Apfelpfannkuchen. It isn't fancy, but it's hearty. They will be done soon. Paul knew he should assure her that the Hopple-Popple would be enough, but his mouth watered at the thought of apple pancakes. He only had those when home to visit his Mutter, and that hadn't been for weeks. Months, actually. Being sent to work at Melchhausen will mean that much longer. Then again, with Lechner dead, would he still be sent to the camp, or would he be in trouble for allowing the man's death? His food stuck in his throat, and Paul coughed. The captain! Frau Bauer didn't even turn from the stove. Hetty and I rolled him in an old carpet and dragged him out to the garage where it's cooler. I've cleaned as much of the blood as I could get from the carpet. I'll try again later for the rest. It was time to cook breakfast. Was the woman that heartless? Did she hate the captain that much? Or was she simply that matter-of-fact about things? Those questions dissipated when the housekeeper set a plate full of Apfelpfannkuchen in front of him and said, The Freifrau was becoming distressed. I'm sure you understand. Where did you get the key? From your pockets when I cleaned your uniform. She pointed to the fireplace where his shirt, trousers, and jacket hung neatly over a drying rack. It should be dry soon. He picked at the robe. Thank you. This is not dignified for an officer.
It is for an injured man, though.
The housekeeper gave him a warm, genuine smile.
We're glad you're here. If Werner came back, would we be safe?
Back. Why did that cause his mind to race? Back. Oh, has the boy been found? This time, genuine concern filled the woman's eyes as she poured him a cup of coffee.
No, Grete is most distressed. Her fever has returned as well.
He ate quicker. Weak or not, he must find that boy. I'll drive to Kuchel first thing. Though Frau Bauer tried to argue, he silenced her with a swift, decided, it must be done. She hesitated only a minute before retrieving an ironing board, pressing cloth, and several flat irons. The irons she placed on a shelf in the fireplace.
I'll dry your uniforms by pressing out the rest of the dampness. It's nearly there as it is and must be pressed. We cannot have our Stutstaffel out and about in a rumpled uniform, or worse, a wet one. You'll catch your death.
Once he finished, and while he waited for the uniform, Paul went to examine the room where the captain had been shot. Perhaps there would be something left to hint at what might have happened. The drawer Minagongol spoke of, or some remnant of the killer's person, a button, or a piece of jewelry. That might prove the staff and their mistress innocent, for surely they would have looked for anything incriminating had they been responsible. The thought was tenuous at best, but Paul clung to it. If either the woman or Werner were responsible, he groaned. The woman. He'd have to find her when he got back, bring her up from the forest, and put her with the captain. Perhaps he should send for the Ordnungspolizei. He'd decide that later, depending on if he found Werner or the boy, and then he could telephone for the SS police when he'd found proof of something. Surely. The sitting room was freezing cold despite a blazing fire. A cursory glance showed every window open, hinting that the room might have had an unpleasant odor. But wasn't it too soon for decay to be a problem? Then again, perhaps the metallic scent of blood had bothered the women. He smelled nothing out of the ordinary, but perhaps he was developing a cold? No, he'd smelled the apple pancakes from across the room. Frau Bauer hadn't exaggerated. They had sopped most of the blood from the rug, but there was still a marked discoloration. Several towels had been folded under the area to absorb moisture and to protect the floors. Near that, he found only a black thread. It could belong to anything that had been there for weeks, depending on Hetty's thoroughness. Near the writing desk, he found a small sliver of green glass. Upon closer inspection, he found that it belonged to the banker's lamp on the edge. A crack ran along the edge of the shade, and the piece fit perfectly. That didn't fit the rest of the room. A black thread could have come off the carpet they used to roll Lechner into. A sliver of glass, however? When his shivers came close enough to be nearly consistent, Paul began closing the windows, sniffing cautiously after each one. He smelled nothing. As he passed the bookcase, his eyes roamed the titles, a few naturalist scientific works, historical, philosophy, and then the novels. He peered closer. Bon Vettelteil, Effie Priest, Mademoiselle de Scudery, and even Wildenbruchs. If he only had time to lose himself in something that would blot out the last 24 hours. Just as he turned to go, he noticed one book sticking out from the rest. Herr Hitler's Mein Kampf. Tilting the top spine back, he tried to wedge it in better, but a discolored stripe down the middle stopped him. He pulled the book from the shelf and flipped to those pages. There, in the middle of what should be Adolf Hitler's manifesto, were page upon page of handwritten notes, names, dates. But for what? Only when he found Grete and Hans as the very last ones did he realize what it must mean. On that page, someone had tucked a folded and tied paper. He pulled the strings and stared at the empty paper. What had it contained? Where had the contents gone? Those are the names of every child that Captain Lechner ordered me to send east instead of west on the Kindertransport." He turned to see Frau Gongol in the doorway. Her eyes flashed and her lip curled as she spat out her confession. "They came in clusters of 10 or even 20. Their foolish parents thinking I would protect their Kinder from deportation to Poland or left as orphans when they were led off to the work camps. But instead, I sent children to the very fate those parents sought to avoid." Again she spat out the word. "Fools." "But why? If the children leave Austria, is that not enough? The goal is to rid Germany and Austria of the Jewish people. Why is sending them to Poland instead of England so important? We invaded Poland." The sneer became even more pronounced. "I would suggest you ask the captain, but—" "You did this. You murdered him. I know it, and—" He watched her gaze back at him, unflinching. "I think you know I know it. But to prove it—" Mina Gongol gave a curt nod at the book and turned to leave. "At least there will be no more notices of sugar shortages in this house." "Sugar shortages?" Her only reply was her laughter as she slipped through the door. Weariness tugged at him. He needed to leave now, or he'd never have the strength to return, much less find a way to drag the woman back to the chateau. Perhaps a Schubkarren? A place as large and grand as Chateau Versteck would need a garden cart, wouldn't it? One step at a time. First to the station. See if anyone has seen the boy. Talk to the woman who delivered the telegram. Not likely to be a suspect now that the woman in the brown coat is dead, but to be thorough. Though he made it to the station just as the rain began, Hans found keeping dry nearly impossible. In the end, he shivered his way through the night using the stolen blanket to protect him from coal dust in the coal shed and to keep his legs a little warmer. Even so, his toes were numb and his stomach protested at such a long time without food. When the shops opened, he could go buy bread, maybe a small pastry, some sausage and cheese. Voices outside told him he needed to move. If someone came to retrieve coal for the trains, he'd be caught. He stood and wrapped the blanket into a ball before peering through the door. A group of men stood joking not 20 feet away. Hans crept out and around the back of the building. Now, where to hide the blanket? If he lost it and didn't make it back to Vienna before nightfall, he might freeze to death. Every place he tried looked suspicious or posed risk of discovery. In the end, he tucked it under the bench Grete had been sitting on when he arrived and shoved it as far back in the corner as he could. That settled, he entered the tiny station and found a washroom. The black streaks on his face and jacket told him he'd made a good decision, and though it took more work than it was worth, he managed to wipe, wash, or beat off most of the black. But when he pushed open the door again, he heard the SS officer speaking to someone at the window. "Boy? About 11, I'm told. He was at Chateau Versteck, but he went missing in the rain yesterday, and we're concerned about him." Hans shrank back. He didn't believe a word the man said. Concerned. Concerned that he might have killed someone. But Nazi officers didn't care what happened to Juden. If the Scharführer wanted him, it would be to put him to death for the murder of his superior. That thought sent him racing from the station as fast as he could run. Down the street, he found a bakery opening and stopped inside to purchase food. He'd need to get it now and be ready for the train to Salzburg. In Salzburg, he might not have time to go find food. Remembering the old man's warning and the round woman's scolding, he hesitated before stepping up behind a harried Hausfrau who needed bread for her husband's noonday meal.
"I still must purchase food and be ready for the train."
The baker, however, didn't blink at a boy purchasing a loaf of Schwarzwälderkruste and just before being told the price, adding a brezeln to the order. The baker laughed and pulled the largest pretzel from the case.
Don't let your Mutti complain that I pressured you to spend her housekeeping money on treats, boy.
Hans grinned.
I won't. He hesitated before asking, where is the best place to buy sausage and cheese?
Something dry? Landjäger?
He nodded.
That would be perfect.
I didn't think I recognized you. The train is early, maybe?
Not here yet, but soon. Mutti will be worried if I don't hurry.
The baker nodded and pointed down the road.
Metzger's. Good name, yeah?
And you are Herr Becker?
Laughter boomed out, and a couple of people behind Hans laughed with him.
Nein. Kruger is my name. Don't forget me. Kruger's makes the best brezeln in all of Austria. See if I don't.
Hans waved at the man as he left and started to tuck his change in with the other Reichsmarks, but he changed his mind. If he lost his coat somehow, he'd lose the money. Then again, what if someone demanded his money? He could lose it that way, too. After some deliberation, he hid half the money in his coat pocket and slipped the rest in his pants pocket. There, he found the still rolled-up little notebook that he'd forgotten about. How had he not noticed it poking into his leg all night? Already, people filled the streets, walking against the brisk wind to get to their destinations, or being pushed along by it if going the other way. He entered Metzger's and waited behind 3 others. The butcher had a case of cheeses and sausages separate from the rest of the meat. He asked for Allgäuer Emmentaler and Landjäger and paid the man. Instead of the friendly baker, though, the butcher scowled and scolded him all the way out the door. I think the butcher needs more bread and less sausage. As he reached the train station, Hans noticed people moving that way, which prompted him to hurry. Maybe it meant the train was coming soon. He needed a ticket and to be ready to get on the moment it rolled in. But as he rounded the corner that led to the platform, he heard the familiar voice of the Scharführer. Where the boy is. Was the officer still asking people about him? I haven't seen him. This time, Hans heard the woman who had given him directions to the chateau. Why are they even there? I've been hearing rumors. Now, Hans crept to the corner of the building and flattened himself against it, listening. Will she tell what they are? What rumors? Yes, Fraulein, what rumors? The children come here to take the Kindertransport to England, but I see the trains they're put on. They go east, on routes that lead to Poland. The transport is to get them out of Austria and Germany to someplace safe, but Poland isn't safe. Children in a war zone. But the Jews are all being sent to Poland now. Why wouldn't the children go? They'd be reunited with their families. The woman's laughter sounded strange to him. You're a fool. Hans couldn't believe she mocked an SS officer to his face. These children are being sent to their deaths. I'm certain of it. And if the rumors have any truth to them, it's far worse than I imagined. The Scharführer argued. Rumors are rarely true. I'm certain that if the children go to Poland instead of England, it's for the best. Getting them out of the country with the current hostilities is a good idea, I think. You think, she spat out. Any day now, the car will arrive and that darling little girl will get out. She'll be put on a train, and I guarantee that a little waif like that will be dead before she reaches her destination. It sounded like the officer would protest, but the woman shushed him. Let me tell you, those who survive the trip will die of starvation, cold, or disease if broken hearts don't kill them first, and all because their parents foolishly trusted the story of a woman in the forest who would take care of their children. The protest growled so low Hans could barely hear it. I can't imagine the women of that house being a party to something so evil. I doubt Frau Bauer or Hetty knows what is happening,
But the Freifrau certainly does. I've taken down dozens of telegrams to be sent to that Captain Lechner in Vienna. Always the same message. We need more sugar at Chateau Versteck. Or, we have no more sugar at Chateau Versteck. I think one says that they have room for more children, and the other says they're full and need transport to take the children away.
You think. Hans, trembling where he stood, barely heard the next words for the thundering of his heart.
I know that within 2 days of every telegram, children are herded onto those trains. The trains go east, officer. East. None of the children have the proper paperwork for England. They do not go to safety. I'd stake my life on it.
At those words, Hans turned and ran. Chapter 12. After breakfast, Mina steeled herself against what she'd find and flung open the doors to the sitting room, where Captain Lechner's body should have lain. Only towels soaking up the dampness in the carpeting gave away that anything had happened. That made her pause. Had the body been there or not when she'd confronted the Scharführer? Why couldn't she remember? She took the long way around the room to the bookshelf and found Mein Kampf lying on the shelf instead of in its proper place. She'd intended to destroy it, to destroy all evidence of the evil that man had made her do. But when their SS officer had gotten to it first, she assumed he'd taken it with him as evidence against her. So why had he left it? The empty packet inside painted a picture that sent shivers through her. Hans. Only he would know where the money came from. He'd disappeared. Then again, Werner probably knew about the book. He could have stolen it. 2 years earlier, she would have sworn their butler was as loyal as they came, but not anymore. First of all, she had to destroy the book. Yes, there were other proofs of the children's existence in the house, but how many? Names, places? Nothing could be attributed to her without that proof, and Captain Lechner had insisted she keep it here and safe. With him dead, only Werner could use it against her. Werner. If he'd taken the money, he'd have taken the book, used it as blackmail, if not as evidence. No, it must have been Hans, which meant he might have tried to go home. She'd have to find him before he could do that. If rumors started flying before she could escape. Starting a fire had never been one of her best skills, but Mina pushed ashes out of the way, layered kindling and a log, and used the book itself to get the fire blazing. Watching the evidence of just how depraved she had become go up in flames was almost as satisfying as knowing the beastly Captain Lechner could never control her again.
"Oh, Freifrau, we would have laid a fire for you."
Hetty rushed in to try to contain the mess she'd made of setting one and froze.
"What happened to your book?"
"I hated it." Heart pounding again, Mina leaned forward and whispered, "Don't tell anyone I burned Herr Hitler's book. I'd be arrested for sure."
"I wouldn't, no."
Hetty looked around as if expecting someone to listen in.
"Frau Bauer and the SS officer found a woman in the woods, strangled. He thinks it's Greta's mother. He thinks Werner killed her and tried to kill him."
That changed everything. Suspecting someone yourself was one thing, but any hopes that the man injured himself and not remembered it died at the thought of a woman dead. Something she'd considered numerous times returned now, and this time, Mina decided it was time.
"You need to pack your things, Hetty. Frau Bauer, too. I'll either drop you in Kugel, Salzburg, or you may come with me, but we have to go."
Even as she spoke, the plan that had begun forming failed. It wouldn't work.
"Are we hiding from Paul Jäger?"
Jäger? Oh, why had he left that book? A trap?
"We are, and yet we aren't. He cannot know that we are leaving."
The more she spoke, the more certain her plans became.
Where is the captain? In the garage, wrapped in the carpet from...
Mina swallowed hard. Her husband's study, the one stained with Albert's blood. After a steadying breath, she forced herself to speak without emotion.
Excellent. Where is the chauffeur now? He drove to Kuchel to see if he could find Hans. I think he's worried that Werner will hurt the boy.
Hetty shot her a glance.
Do you think so?
As much as she didn't want to admit it, Mina thought it probable, but she toned down her response to, "It's possible." Then she added, "Wrap up warmly and find the Schubkarren. It's probably with the hose and spades and things. We'll need it." Hetty gave her an odd look, but before the young woman could go in search, Mina asked,
"We're closing the house. Where will you want to go?"
After thinking about it for far longer than they had time for her to waste, Hetty sighed.
"With you, if I may. There's nothing but work in my father's shop here."
"It could be dangerous with me, Hetty." The girl hesitated before insisting.
"I still want to go with you."
"Good girl. Go get the things and wrap well. It's cold out."
"I need to speak to Frau Bauer."
At the door, Hetty's voice stopped her.
"Don't let her come, please. She has family in Kuchel. She often says she wishes she could spend more time with them. Please urge her to stay. She should be with family."
Her gaze faltered.
"Especially in these times."
"That is the most mature thing I've ever heard you say. We'll make sure of it. I'll make it worth her while to stay, and worth yours to come with me. Now, go." A gray pallor hovered over Chateau Versteck. The sky, the trees, even the golden stucco all looked as if dusted with ash. Paul pulled into the drive and near the garage in order to make transferring the captain's body into it all that much easier. Despite every instinct to the contrary, he knew that if the body were found at the chateau, everyone in the house could be imprisoned until the guilty party was found. Killing officers of the Third Reich would not, could not, go unpunished. He'd have to dispose of it somehow, somewhere, and once he did, he'd have to run. The women would know it wasn't them. Herr Werner never would. But if he could take the children with him, at least they'd be safe. Another part of him mocked the idea. The children were not in any danger. The idea couldn't be more ludicrous. Still, the woman at the station, Lena Weiss, had insisted that the Kinder would not be sent to England, that none of the children had. Well, these two would. He'd make sure of it. He just had to find Hans first. Fräulein Weiss promised to watch the station all through the night. He would scour the house and the woods, but after he removed that body, he had to protect the women. Herr Werner could not prove the captain had died there if the evidence were removed and the body had been taken far from the chateau. If caught, he'd end up in a camp at best, although perhaps a firing squad would be better. Then I must not allow myself to make a mistake or get caught. He found Frau Bauer and Grete making more cookies in the kitchen. The little girl rolled her crescents with her tongue sticking out to the left and her head cocked right, as if that would ensure the perfect shape and size. She grinned up at him.
"See? I'm helping. Frau Bauer says Mutti would be proud of me."
I'm sure she would. Why isn't Hans helping? Grete wilted.
"I can't find him. He's nowhere."
Her lips drooped even more.
"I was good and said everything just as he told me to."
If he'd had any doubt that the boy was guilty of something, those words killed it. Please, don't be guilty of murder. As unfair as it was, Paul decided to take advantage of the situation. Did Hans see who shot the captain? Grete shook her head.
"He didn't, but he said you would say he did it, so he made me tell you that he was with me."
But he wasn't. Of course not. Herr Werner had fired that shot, and despite his earlier certainty that Mina Gongol had done it, Paul felt certain of it, and just as certain that Hans was right. Herr Werner would blame the boy. And if Herr Werner got to Hans first... Paul hunkered down beside Greta. I need you to listen to me. Listen carefully. Do you understand? Greta nodded, eyes wide. I can't protect Hans from Herr Werner if I don't know where he is. Are you sure Hans didn't say anything about where he would hide? Greta answered only with a shake of her head. After shooting Frau Bauer an apologetic look, Paul turned back to Greta. I need you to help me protect him. When you see him, don't say anything, but tell someone where he is. Me, Frau Bauer, Hedy, the Freifrau. Just not Herr Werner. If you see that man, don't let him see you. Do you understand? The child's solemn eyes grew yet wider, and she gave a single nod.
Yeah.
He would have turned to go, but Frau Bauer wouldn't hear anything of it.
You will sit down and eat, right now.
With her arms folded over her chest and a glare that would make Der Führer shiver in his boots, the housekeeper stood guard over him until he'd eaten every bite. With the fire crackling in the hearth, bread baking in the oven, and the scent of nuts and vanilla making him wish the cookies were baking too, Paul had the unexpected and irresponsible desire to grab one of the books he'd seen and settle in for a cozy afternoon. Instead, he rose. I should take care of a few things. Be sure to take care, he added as an ineffective but sincere afterthought.
Will you go bring back the other thing you found in the forest? I think it's only right. It's proof, if nothing else, of your story.
He'd thought to deal with that later. As much as he'd like to leave her as proof of what had happened, the wild animals wouldn't leave her alone. If you think...
Please, Schafführer, don't let us become desensitized to basic decencies.
With instructions for how to find the wheelbarrow ringing in his ears, Paul pulled on his coat again and took off for the garden shed where Frau Bauer insisted he'd find it and a shovel with which to dig a grave. If only he could find Herr Werner and make the animal dig it for him. This time, Paul brought his own Ruger with him. Though everything in the shed was neat, tidy, and impossibly clean for a garden shed, mud and leaves clung to the barrow's front wheel, and the handle rests at the back. Inside the barrow, leaves and mud were plastered here and there, and the mud was still wet. Paul wanted to stop right there and go ask Frau Bauer, who might have used it recently, but he doubted the housekeeper would know. The logical person was Herr Werner. If he'd already retrieved the body... To say Paul ran through the mud and leafy carpeting on the forest floor would be an overstatement. He stumbled and fumbled his way between the trees at as quick a clip as he could manage. But where he thought he'd been couldn't have been correct. Then he remembered that he'd made for an upstairs light in the middle of the house, but he'd ended up on the far side of the garden. He moved northeast a bit and tried again. Occasionally he saw disturbances in the leaves. Animal or man? The answer came when he finally saw where the woman must have lain. The rain had helped create a slight depression in the earth, and footprints were all over the place. Drag marks, too. The musty, earthy scents mingled with evergreen to create a perfume no man would ever match. At times like this, with such raw beauty before him and surrounded by majestic trees, his confidence that the idea of an almighty God being a myth wavered. His Mutter now believed in a God, a sacrificial, loving God who demanded justice and holiness and then provided it for man because of man's inability to provide it himself. When all this is over, he promised himself, I'll write and ask her about it. Maybe she can sway me to believe in her God. But all the musing about the existence of some grand deity couldn't change the fact that a woman's body had once been where he now stood, and now she was gone. The 11-mile trip from Chateau Versteck up the cliff road would have taken half the time if they didn't have to take a road so far north. On the other hand, it made the ruse more plausible that they'd turned wrong and gone out of the way all the way up to the cliff. Few automobiles attempted the road, but Mina sat with hands gripped on the steering wheel and going slow enough to glance over her shoulder every few hundred yards to see that Hetty really could drive her car up the winding road. How had she not known Hetty's brother was a mechanic? Had Albert? Even as she asked the question, the answer screamed itself from her mind to her heart. Of course he had. Albert had always been attentive to their servants, while she neglected them until only Hetty and Frau Bauer remained. She'd planned to take the car all the way to the top, but at a particularly treacherous curve, she stopped and eyed it. Here. This was the place. Without bothering to pull over, no one would attempt this narrow road today. She turned the wheel toward the edge of the cliff, stopped Captain Lechner's large Mercedes, and set the parking brake, but left the engine running. When she stepped out of the vehicle, Hetty parked the Gongol's Mercedes as well. It took all the strength both women had to drag Captain Lechner from one side of the car to the other, but eventually he sat behind the wheel. She tucked a full flask of schnapps in his coat pocket and stashed a bottle behind his seat. Would there be anything left of either of them? She didn't know, but she wouldn't chance it. Dragging the woman from the back seat and into the passenger seat proved even more difficult, but Mina had decided on a girlfriend rather than a prisoner. No one would know who she was. Nobody but her. Frau Bauer would have known if she'd seen her. Greta resembled her mother. At last, the stage was set. She set fire to the papers and small kindlings she'd wadded up beneath the seat and told Hetty to move away from the car. I don't know how quickly it will reach the fuel tank. The flames were already creating warmth as Mina released the parking brake and stepped back. She slammed the door shut and moved around to the back to help Hetty push it over. Their combined shoves and grunts didn't budge the heavy vehicle. Mina dug her heels in and tried pushing from behind. She nearly got run over by the car as it slid back toward her an inch or two. Hetty grunted again.
Can you hold it back so it won't roll?
I think so. Why?
I see a dead tree through there. Maybe I can break off a branch to use as a lever. I'll be right back.
Mina urged her to hurry. The flames were licking at the clothes, and things would get even more gruesome any minute. If Albert was right, and there is a loving God, please have mercy on me for doing this. When Hetty returned carrying a stick only a few inches thick, Mina wanted to cry. How would that push the car? But instead of shoving it one way or the other, the younger woman pushed the branch beneath the car and told Mina to help her push the top of it. The branch groaned until both women declared it would break any second. Then Mina stopped.
Did you put the car in neutral?
Of course she hadn't. The moment she did, Hetty gave a shove, and Mina stepped away just in time to watch it roll past and over the cliff. An explosion ripped through the gorge as the car crashed to the bottom. Hetty tugged at her sleeve.
We must go, Freifrau. If someone sees it, they will come. If they see us.
But they saw no one all the way down the hill and around to the Kuchel station. In fact, the whole thing seemed far too easy. Standing in front of the station was a tall, fair, handsome man in rough work clothes stained with oil around the cuffs and waist.
That is Stefan. He's left his coat as usual. Always scolds, but he says he works hard to keep warm.
From the back seat, Mina pulled 2 large suitcases and handed a third, plus the key, to Hetty. "Hurry, we must get on the 2:15 train to Salzburg." A glance back showed Hetty hugging the handsome man and waving goodbye before rushing up to Mina to take one of the other suitcases.
"Are we really going to Holland?"
"First, then to Italy. We have a villa there. We'll wait out the war and then return to Vienna." She stopped and gave Hetty a searching look. "Are you certain you want to come? You must know." But Hetty cut her off. "I know. I want to come." Chapter 13. With every care, Hans tramped through the trees along the road so no one could follow his footsteps and find him, entered the sitting room through the window again, and though he expected to use the door he felt sure he'd find hidden now that he'd had time to think about it, instead, he'd rushed out the open sitting room door and up the far stairs to the empty dormitories. No one had seen him. So when an arm cut off his breathing and a hand covered his mouth, Hans flailed for a moment before trying to fight.
"Keep still, or the little girl will pay for your insolence."
Not recognizing the voice, he decided it must be the man, Herr Werner. Hans did as he was told.
"You shouldn't have come back here, but weaklings and fools will always do stupid things."
As he spoke, the man released some of the pressure on Hans's neck. Hans croaked out,
"Is Greta safe?"
"For now, I might even send her back to Vienna, if you do as you are told."
He had to do it, but the condition rankled.
"What do you want?"
"Where is the Freifrau?"
What a question. How was he to know? But if it kept him alive...
"She was in her room the last time I saw her."
"She drove away."
"With Greta? To the train? No. I didn't see. I wasn't here."
"Where is Captain Lechner's body?"
The body? In the big room, the one Hetty called the sitting room. Pain exploded behind his eyes when the man's hand connected with the side of his head.
"Don't mock me, boy."
Mock him? Hans would love to, but even Herr Werner had to know where the man had been killed. Then he understood. The body had been moved. Herr Werner shoved Hans away from him, and before he could bolt, the man said,
"I will happily shoot you if you make a sound or try to run. Now, go to your room."
Hans stepped forward and into the hall, only to see Greta tiptoeing across the attic. His heart hammered in his chest. Just as Herr Werner should have seen her, the roar of an engine and the squeal of brakes on the cobblestones caught the man's attention. While he looked for a window, Hans pointed to a doorway with one hand and put his finger to his lips with the other.
"Please understand and listen, Greta. If I came back for you for nothing, I'll murder you myself."
That thought churned bile in his gut with such ferocity that he tasted it.
"No, they won't make me like them, but I will scold you until I sound like Mutti."
Greta ducked out of sight the moment Herr Werner shoved him toward the stairs.
"Maybe she's back. We'll see how soft she's gone. Let's go."
But on the second floor, Hans found himself forced into a bedroom overlooking the drive. A man stood next to a beautiful car.
"Who is that man?"
"I don't know." Just then, they both saw Frau Bauer carry 2 suitcases out to the car and drop them at the man's feet. They spoke for a minute or so before the housekeeper turned back and hurried inside. Werner started to push Hans down the hall when he made an abrupt change and jerked Hans back toward the stairs.
"Let's go."
"Why are you taking me? Why not kill me?"
The only answer he could conceive was that Herr Werner thought he might use him to make Frau Bauer or Hetty or even the SS officer do something. But what did he want?
"Why did you kill the captain?"
Asking the question was probably foolish. Hans braced himself for another whack upside the head, but Herr Werner only laughed.
I didn't. Don't you know? That witch of a Freifrau did it. She blamed him for her husband's weakness and got her revenge, but I'll see her dead if I have to do it myself.
He didn't believe the man. But what if it were true? The Scharführer didn't do it. Hans couldn't imagine Hetty or Frau Bauer murdering anyone. That left only this half-crazed man, or the mistress of the chateau, a baroness no less. Surely he lied. His weary, blistered feet faltered and tripped over the last step. Hans sprawled out onto the hallway floor, his nose connecting with the carpet runner. Blood began to ooze even before the sting of impact subsided. He tried to pinch it to stop himself from dripping on the carpet, but found himself jerked up and shoved forward once more.
Clumsy boy. Get going.
At the entrance hall, Herr Werner ordered him to stop. He seemed to hesitate before telling Hans to open the door and ask the man what he wanted. Hans swallowed hard and moved to the door. If he rushed through it and out, would this man shoot a stranger? The odds were high that he'd die, but wouldn't he die anyway? But before he could pull the door open, he heard movement and the clatter of the gun on the floor, a roar of pain, and the SS officer saying,
I've been looking for you, Herr Werner.
A derisive laugh escaped.
Oh, does your wrist hurt? You might have a slight picture of how my head feels. I congratulate you on your stealth. I must confess I didn't hear you, although I did see movement. I should have hit you until I knew you were dead. Oh, but why add 3 murders to your name? Aren't 2 enough?
The officer addressed Hans.
Go ask Frau Bauer for rope and a straight-backed chair.
As Hans turned to go, he heard Herr Werner quietly assert that he had only killed the woman in the forest. When he returned, Frau Bauer on his heels, the former butler raged, even lunging for the gun a time or two. If it had been Hans, he would have shot the man for the attempt.
Ah, excellent.
The SS officer offered the housekeeper her choice of tying the man to the chair or holding him at gunpoint. She chose tying, and if the grunts and moans Herr Werner let out meant what Hans thought they did, she made certain to pull each knot good and tight. The moment the housekeeper rose, she spat in Herr Werner's face and turned to Paul.
It is time for you to go. If the Freifrau killed the captain,
both Frau Bauer and Herr Werner said in unison,
She did.
He blinked back his surprise and tried to remain stoic.
Then I am compelled to arrest her and take her to the Ordnungspolizei.
You can't do that, she said.
They're gone,
Herr Werner added as if determined to have his own say. This seemed to send the housekeeper over the edge. She walked over to a table set against the wall and ripped the long runner from it. A lamp and a vase crashed to the floor. They all stared at her, and even little Greta, who had been making her way down the hall to see what was happening, froze in her tracks. But the woman paid them no mind. She doubled the runner, rolled it a bit, jerked it between Werner's teeth as if it were a bit in a horse's mouth, and tied it behind his head.
There, now, I will tell you so that you can be certain of your facts if you choose to share them with your superiors. The Freifrau and Hetty are gone.
Where?
I don't know.
She shook her head as Paul began to protest.
I specifically told them not to tell me. Your things are in the car out front. Hetty's brother is here to drive you to wherever you need to go, or to give you the car if you prefer to take it.
She hesitated before adding,
You will get the children on the Kindertransport. Get them whatever they need to help them safely out of the country.
He hated to do it, especially with the children listening, but Paul had no choice.
It depends on if I learn what happened to the captain. I already have a confession about the woman.
Herr Werner will write a confession to killing both people while I tell you how the Freifrau did it.
So she had done it. He'd been right about that. Paul brought paper, the now emptied hall table, and a pen, and ordered Herr Werner to write. The man refused. Paul cocked the hammer and held it to his head. In his peripheral vision, he saw Hans block Greta's view. Not much confidence in Werner's obedience. But the man wrote, and Frau Bauer gave her own confession.
I knew the Freifrau was guilty when I saw her come from the dining room. She would never have been in there at that time of day, so I knew she'd killed him, slipped through the hidden door, and run for the hall like the rest of us. Her acting like she didn't know what the sound was only solidified my suspicions, but Captain Lechner only got what he deserved, so I said nothing.
Hans spoke up.
Where's the door? I looked and looked for one like it in the dining room to the butler's pantry, but I couldn't find it.
While she explained where there was a button to a sliding panel, Paul thought, the butler's pantry, dining room. He shot her a quick look. Is that why you chose the dining room for keeping everyone together?
She nodded. If we needed to get the Freifrau out, it would be the best chance of success.
Where is the captain's body?
Again, the woman shrugged. All I know is the Freifrau Gongol and Hetty drove away in the cars with both bodies in the captain's. They didn't tell me where they went, but they did say they were not returning.
And all this because... Tears filled the woman's eyes.
Because she hated the captain for killing her husband and for making her do what she did. She never wanted to, but she didn't have the Freiherr's strength of character. She wanted to live here, safe. She only hoped that things weren't as bad as Lechner made them out to be.
A scoffing sound from Werner hinted that it had been a fool's hope.
He could be like that, the woman insisted, and I think it kept her sane to believe it. All those children, their parents thinking they were safe. I just hope they'll be reunited now that they're sending adults too.
Werner finished writing and signed with a scrawl that could have been anyone's signature. Paul looked at it, frowned, and passed it to the woman. Does that look like Herr Werner's signature? She scanned it, barely looking, and nodded.
It's his.
Werner stared, but Paul decided it must be an attempt at intimidation. Now he had to think. Should he do as she suggested? Get the children safe, and then take the confession to Vienna? He could...
Go, Scharführer. Get far away from here. Send someone for this piece of dirt in a day or two, after the Kinder are on the transport. I'll keep him fed and warm until then. After that, I'm going home to live with my sister.
He could do it. He could take the children and go. Get their papers, put them on the Kinder transport, and then stumble into headquarters as if he'd had to make his way back there by his wits. And with his head injury, they'd believe he'd been overpowered by Werner. Are the children's things in the car, too? She smiled and shook her head.
By the kitchen door, in case you said no. Look under the cloth.
With one look back at the struggling Werner and the glowering Frau Bauer, Paul led the children to the kitchen, retrieved the suitcases, and then hurried back through the house and out the front door. A man, Stefan, offered him the keys to the car. Or I can drive you if you prefer. I'll drive, but perhaps you'd like a ride back to town? Stefan hesitated, glanced over his shoulder, and nodded. I'd appreciate that. Danke. Chapter 14. All the way from Kuchel to Salzburg, all as they readied for bed in the hotel room the Herr Jäger had rented, and long into the next day, Hans and Greta repeated the story their new friend had given them. As they neared their destination, Herr Jäger sent them over it one last time. Your turn, Hans. Tell me.
My name is Hans Weiss. My family is from Kuchel. Our grandmother was Jewish, so our family is sending us to England. Grete is my sister. As soon as the war is over, we are to go back to my father's sister, Lena, in Kuchel. Our parents died on Kristallnacht. Grete is sickly and must stay with me so I can take care of her. Here, Grete piped up.
He takes very good care of me. He even carries me up the stairs when he says he won't.
Hans shook his head and rolled his eyes. He hadn't thought she'd been awake. Herr Jäger laughed and asked, "And what do you do if you don't know how to answer, Grete?"
I pretend to be shy.
She giggled.
But I'm really not very shy.
"You are until the war is over." He sighed as they reached a tall, imposing-looking building. "All right, here we are." The man turned to Hans again. "I will come for you when the war is over. If you can't go back to Kuchel and to Lena Weiss, then stay where you are, no matter what. If you get to Lena and she's not there, tell someone where you go, so I can find you." He wanted to ask what to do if Herr Jäger never came, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. "As soon as we reunite, I'll help you find your family." Family, because Grete had none anymore. None that they knew of without telling the girl that her mutti had been killed too, and that he'd promised not to do until she was older. When they reached the doors to their new futures, Hans glanced up at the man who had first pursued him and then rescued him.
I think God brought you to save us. Thank you.
He dug into his pocket and pulled out the rolled-up, hand-sewn booklet. It was time to trust it to someone who might be able to use them to help, someday.
Here, you rescued us. Maybe you can rescue some of these as well. You were brave. Thank you.
Not to be outdone, Grete reached into the pocket of the little red coat she said her friend had given her and handed Paul a paper.
Here's my secret.
Paul read it, frowning and urging them out of the way as a woman led 3 small children up the steps. "My ransom note." He held it out to Hans. "Why do you give this to her?"
I didn't.
He read it. "Come speak to me in the kitchen, or I'll have to turn Grete over to the authorities."
You held her for ransom? Why?
"Mostly to protect you, but in case you were responsible." Herr Jäger shrugged. "I didn't know you yet. Didn't know any of you. I didn't think you could have done it, but if you had, none of us were safe, especially Grete." The words swirled in his mind as ideas formed.
So, you held her for ransom and ransomed her at the same time?
A smile, a nod. Their rescuer shrugged. "My Mutter says it is like Jesus Christ. He was taken captive himself to set us all free."
Do you think that's true?
It seemed fantastical, but his Fati had said things like that. The SS officer straightened his sleeves and squared his shoulder. "I don't know, but I plan to find out. I'll tell you when we meet again." Surrounded by familiar trees on a road she'd traveled for nearly 2 decades, Frau Bauer stared at Chateau Versteck, a lump in her throat. Such a shame to leave things this way, but one did what had to be done. This was war, after all. She closed her eyes and listened as the wind whipped through the trees. It would be a cold trek to Kuchel, but Anna had stew on the stove and had promised to have water boiling for a bath. She'd miss the hot and cold taps, but she'd never miss what this house had become. The unmistakable scent of impending snow grew nearer with each gust. Perhaps the first flakes would fall. And, as if on cue, one touched her nose. Another floated down before her eyes as she opened them. And there, in the window of the room below the children's dormitory, she saw the first flicker. A moment later, flames shot up in the other dormitory. The second floor seemed to glow as if someone had flicked a switch and lit up the whole place in one movement. How had it taken so long for the flames to reach the windows like that? Some day they might find that swine Werner lying in the very place Freiherr Gangl had been shot dead, but she doubted anyone would know who he was. A sigh escaped as she turned away. How she'd wanted to let him sit there in the hallway and watch the flames grow closer, a taste of the hell he now occupied. But she couldn't do it. Instead, she'd ensured a swift death with the Freiherr's pistol. The first and last time she'd ever touch one of those horrible things. Weak. You are so weak. Anna said compassionate, merciful. Anna swore if she'd only ask forgiveness, the Lord would be faithful to forgive any sin, but she couldn't quite believe it. Not a sin she made with the expectation of forgiveness. That surely was unforgivable. Still, Anna promised to show her verses, promised to explain so she would be truly repentant. It wasn't about being good enough or saying enough prayers. That's what Anna said. Maybe. The tinkling of breaking glass caused her to turn once more. The chateau was engulfed now. Time for her to go. Time for the horror to be over. Forever. Historical notes. While I tried to keep as much of this story possible within the confines of actual historical fact, I found it difficult to be certain which way things could have gone. Where I failed to keep it plausible, I pray that the fairy tale element of the story can cover those multitudes of literary and research sins. Where possible, I tried to honor those who fought for the Jews and against tyranny. One notable choice was in Albert Gangl. Albert was named after Joseph Gangl, a part of the Austrian resistance, and died on May 5, 1945, just days before the end of the war. He fought at the Battle of Itter Castle, just over 100 kilometers away from Versteck's fictional position. One problem I encountered was finding accurate train routes across Austria during that era. There are maps before and after, but even those aren't clear to me. It may be poor research skills or terms, or it may be that it changed often after the Anschluss, but I finally had to give up and create my own route between Salzburg and Kuchel, and I chose to make my characters have to change trains based on what I saw. This could be entirely wrong, and if so, I'm terribly sorry. The German convention is to capitalize all nouns. I started writing the book that way whenever using the actual German word, and it became confusing to my English reading mind. So, for those familiar with German, my apologies. I took a wild guess and made the assumption that if it confused me, it might confuse other English-dominant readers as well. Oh boy, was the Nazi ranking and the SS information convoluted. The worst was trying to find a definitive way that a citizen would address an SS officer, and finding the right officer ranking for Paul. I finally had to choose something low and pray it was remotely correct. I seriously doubt it is, and I would be happy to change it if anyone is familiar with what someone in his position would have been. I'd also like to note that by the time this book takes place, Austria had already converted to Celsius versus Fahrenheit. However, since this book is published in America, I decided not to make the majority of my readers have to do the mental conversion. My apologies to the rest of the world. The Kindertransport was similar to Operation Pied Piper, where the children were sent away from their parents to safety as refugees in England, Holland, and Sweden. This overlapped with the first trains to Poland for Jews of all ages. Many of the children on the Kindertransport were orphans or homeless, but others sent their children to safety as well. While Austrian Jews were not expelled to Poland until October 12, 1939, Polish Jews in Germany had been expelled after Kristallnacht, and Poland refused them entrance, and other trains of Jews were sent into Poland as well. I chose to use that fact to create the mass eviction of Jewish children, not to safety, but to Poland where they would likely die from malnutrition and exposure. I wanted this to be a picture of the various attitudes of the German-Austrian people. those who took out their frustration on the acceptable groups, those who developed a hatred brought on by fear or by propaganda, and those who used that fear to further their own ends. Mina was frankly terrified and wanted to protect herself, but the captain used that fear to exploit his own end, a foreshadowing of the Jewish Holocaust. Herr Werner had been brainwashed by propaganda and would do anything to prove himself loyal to the Reich. And Paul Jaeger didn't understand how depraved things had become until he couldn't help but see it for himself. Finally, I wanted justice for the murders. As wronged as Mina Gongol was by Captain Lechner, murder is murder. Execution for his crime was not in her purview. The same goes for Frau Bauer. However, just as the housekeeper said, this is war, and during war, things happen in ways they should not. Hans giving Paul that booklet, having the signed and false confession, and knowing that had he left with Mina, Paul possessed proofs helpful to a court. I would like to believe that he would allow the justice system to decide what to do about it all. I pray that if Frau Bauer were real, she would listen to her sister, repent, and confess her own crime as well. Writing a book where that justice is only hoped for in the end was difficult, but I felt an almost overpowering need to make the story trust God for that justice, rather than the unlikely tying up of neat strings in a very messy time in history. I hope you'll forgive that. The End. This is Krista Del Sorbo. We hope you have enjoyed this production of A Ransomed Grete, an ever-after mystery, written by Chautona Havig. Thank you for listening.